Hi, everyone, and welcome back to that UFO podcast. My name is Andy, and I am joined on today's show by a returning guest, the co founder and editor in chief of The DeBrief, host of his own fantastic show, the Micah Hanks program, might give away a bit of the name, writer, podcaster, and as I've always said, one of the great voices in all of audio, whether that's radio, podcasting, or otherwise. Micah, welcome back to the podcast.
Andy, always good to be here. How are you, sir?
I'm very well. It's really good to have you on. And top of the show, I just want to start off, Micah, sending our thoughts to Ryan Sprague and family. Ryan Sprague, host of Summer in the Skies podcast. Folks may know him from that. His mother sadly passed away a couple of days ago as of recording this. I know you've worked closely with Ryan as well, and just wanted to say a big shout out to Ryan and family and hope they're all doing as well as can be.
Oh, certainly, yeah. And again, I mirror those sentiments. I tried to send Ryan a message last night, and I think actually right now, since I'm not sure where he is in relation to the Atlantic Ocean, so I'm not sure if the message went through. I've got to check in with him again. So if Ryan, if you're out there listening and you hear this before you get that message, my condolences, and we all wish you the best, brother.
Yeah, all the best, Ryan. And if you get a chance, send Ryan a message and just send him your thoughts. Him and his family will no doubt appreciate it. And I'm sure he'll appreciate us getting on with the show as well, as he probably would tell me to do at this point. So, Micah, there's a lot to go over. It's been the quietest, busiest period I've ever known for news, depending where you fall on the fence of social media. I want to go do a bit of a state of play with you. Where is the UFO topic right now? A lot of moving parts in place. We're going to look at Whistleblowers, AARO, Sean Kirkpatrick, the James Webb Telescope, Nazca Mummies, and everything else in between. But to kick off, Micah, for anyone listening to you for the first time, maybe to this show for the first time, let's talk about the DeBrief. And just remind folks, how are things over at the DeBrief? And for new listeners, what exactly is it?
Well, as far as how things are going, it's always busy, but things are good. I guess that no news, they say, is good news. Although there are always some stories kind of percolating on the back end of things. And so naturally, one of the first questions people always ask me is, what big stories are you working on? And I mean, if I just, dropped too many hints, they may not end up being big stories on down the line. We're always working on different things, not always exclusive to UAP. I mean, that's a topic that a lot of people in this area know us for. I mean, but really the majority of what we publish has to do with astronomy, defense, other areas of the sciences, a lot of energy research and things along those lines, especially developments regarding fusion. And there've been a lot of those recently. AI is another really huge area where we're increasingly focusing on that a lot these days, just because, I mean, there's so much about it. And I mean, often, Andy, I end up looking at myself today and imagining 10 years from now, where are we all going to be? What's it really going to look like? What's the landscape with regard to UAP, AI, defense, all these situations going to look like in 10 years, given the technological, not just the developments currently underway, but also the increasingly expedited rate of growth of technology, because there's this cumulative effect, I think, with as more technologies are piled onto one another over time. And again, AI continually escalating it, for now, maybe in good ways, machine learning, helping, but nonetheless quickening that pace. The rate of growth of technology doesn't go like this. It's not just a linear growth. I mean, it's greater than exponential. And over time, we're going to get to a point, some technologists call that singularity, where all this stuff is going to really kind of outpace humanity. And I'm eager but frightened to know what it's going to be like once we reach that knee of the curve, so to speak.
Do you think we're in a good place? Because like you say, you mentioned the DeBrief covers so much defense, science, tech, and it's not all totally separate from the UAP UFO topic, depending on how you want to look at it or which angle you attack this. Are things in a good place? Like you mentioned, AI, big buzzword for 2024, I think, already. And like you quite rightly say, some of it's machine learning and it's not necessarily the same thing. These things are all kind of coming together and at an alarming rate, like you mentioned as well. Are things in a good place for the world right now?
Well, I wouldn't say that the world is in a good place per se. I mean, you look at, for instance, again, defense being really kind of one of my main beats, you might say, as a journalist, in the reporting that I do, both as a writer and also as an editor at the DeBrief. You look at the, conflict right now in Ukraine, you look at the conflict in the Middle East, you look at situations that are developing in the Indo-Pacific region, ongoing concerns about militarization of space. I wouldn't say that we're necessarily in a good place right now, but there's always hope because, again, we've also made it this far since the end of the Second World War without a full-blown global conflict. My hope is that although some conflict is going to be inevitable, that maybe we will be able to unite more of the world's forces and prevent global military conflict. But now, again, with AI and with all of the accessibility to various technologies, especially just the World Wide Web and all of the good and the bad that comes with that, one might argue that the landscape of conflict going forward further into the 21st century is going to be a digital landscape. I mean, there's going to be more, and we're already seeing this right now. Hospitals being taken offline, water systems in small towns and things like that being taken down, held ransom, by hackers, many of them suspected of being linked back to Russia. And even if they are not actually state sponsored, I think that to an extent that kind of a thing is encouraged by those state actors who are, again, recognized as foreign adversaries of the United States and really of, NATO nations, the West, we might say in general. So I think that really the battle of tomorrow, the landscape on which that's going to take place very well may be the digital one. And then again, we come to AI. AI definitely has a lot of, potentials for misuse. And that's really one of my greatest concerns about AI. It's not like this Terminator style thing where, the machines are going to rise and they're going to become intelligent and they're going to realize we're all tantamount to insects and they're going to take us all down. No, I'm more concerned about humans really on the cusp of fully autonomous artificial intelligence. How humans might misuse that technology and increasingly find ways to misuse that, which is unfortunately going to have a whole lot more potential for destruction, in my opinion, than the AI all by itself.
You mentioned a lot about conflict, and I don't think there's any greater conflict in the UFO community as to the varying opinions and whatnot. So let's dive into it, Micah, because I think a lot of what you say is going to come back through the conversation. I don't think there's any better place to start than with AARO, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office that was headed up previously by Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick. Let me ask, because it's been a good while since we spoke, probably a year and a half. What was your opinion on the formation of AARO? A lot of folks, to be fair, at the beginning were very pessimistic. They were curious this was going to be another whitewash, a Blue Book 2.0, which, to be fair, seems to be the way it's gone. I tried to be optimistic at the beginning to say maybe this Kirkpatrick guy coming in as a neutral, it's not an Elizondo, it's not a Mellon, it's not a name we know, so maybe they'll treat it in a different way, which could be a good thing. I was probably wrong. What was your thoughts on how AARO started off and where it's gone?
I think you and I may have even touched on this. I mean, at the very outset, it had, of course, been leaked that Sean Kirkpatrick was likely to be the director. I believe that Douglas Johnson can be credited with that. I had been given somewhat advanced knowledge of that. And in fact, I'd been attending a aerospace conference in Huntsville, Alabama, related to UAP, put on by the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies back in 2022. Jay Stratton, the former director of the UAP Task Force, was there in attendance. And there had been some talk about whether Dr. Kirkpatrick at that point might not even show up and make a brief appearance. But it was already kind of in the background chatter, you might say, at that point, that he was fairly, I won't say dismissive of, I will say that at least in terms of his profession, that there was almost a bit of adversarial kind of attitude, or at least the perception of that kind of attitude coming from Dr. Kirkpatrick. He seemed to have no love lost for the people who had been involved previously in U.S. government investigations of UAP, namely with, previous programs like the DIA's Advanced Aerospace Weapons Systems Application Program, or ALSAP, and perhaps some of those that followed as well. So that was the information that was kind of conveyed to me at the time. Apart from that, there was, for the longest time, maybe one or two photographs of Dr. Kirkpatrick that even were available online. But we did know about his background, frankly, some of it very impressive. And so in addition to his credentials and also those early appearances that he made, first, I think that there was a off-camera briefing that he participated in which the DoD released some information in advance of their annual UAP report. But then subsequently, of course, there was the Senate hearing that was presided over by Kirsten Gillibrand, U.S. Senator from New York, in which Kirkpatrick is there, speaking in this official capacity, and this, of course, being televised all around the world. And much to my surprise, I mean, he was providing some data. He had referred to a so-called target package involving these particular spherical UAP, and there was a lot of information about everything from radio signatures to hyperacceleration and other unique capabilities that some of these objects, which again he and his office AARO seemed to classify as being UAP, that they were capable of, and that AARO had been tracking, and that these were the kinds of objects they were interested in. All of that information early on was extremely promising, and I'll just admit, it wasn't necessarily popular at the time, but I started out as a fan of Dr. Kirkpatrick. I really did. I thought that he was doing an excellent job. I thought that he was attempting to show a lot more transparency. I didn't detect a lot of bias. Nonetheless, I continued to hear from people, some who had actually worked with him previously, and others. And of course, there's always the rumor mill out there on social media. So there was a lot of, opinion being injected from that area too. But I continued to get perspectives from people who said, we're afraid eventually that his, congenial demeanor is probably going to be overshadowed by other traits that he's known for. I held out hope, and I continued to be pretty impressed by AARO. Another really high mark for me, I think, was when the NASA Independent UAP Study Team, released their findings, and they held a press conference. Or I'm sorry, it may have been prior to that. Actually, it was during one of their early briefings. Dr. Kirkpatrick not only participated, but, I was in the press pool. I didn't get a question, and there were a lot of people in front of me, but I was on the phone in the press pool that day covering that for the debrief. And when I heard a question addressed regarding AARO, and Dr. Kirkpatrick chimes in and says, I'll take that question. Again, I was very impressed that he had participated in that briefing. Again, he is part of the DoD, and he is the director of AARO. He's not part of the NASA team. He didn't have to be there, and yet he was. So these were all good indications. And then we had the departure, I guess, of Dr. Kirkpatrick late last year, as was announced. Really, that even foreshadowed by following the congressional hearings last June, where we had, the whistleblower David Grusch, along with the two former Navy pilots, Ryan Graves and Dave Fravor, under oath testifying to members of Congress. The following day, Dr. Kirkpatrick had, made a statement on LinkedIn where he was fairly disparaging, I would say, to put it lightly, of the whistleblowers. A lot of people were taken back by that. I was too. There was a statement that was provided to the debrief. Tim McMillan reached out to Dr. Kirkpatrick, and Tim and I subsequently wrote about that statement that was posted on LinkedIn. I also got a statement from the Pentagon that was essentially confirming that, he in his private life on his personal social media can say what he wants to, but that's not like an official Pentagon statement or anything. I've often wondered what the dynamics behind the scenes were with regard to that. But in any case, Dr. Kirkpatrick left the office late last year. And then suddenly we see all of these media appearances. And there's a marked shift, I think, a departure from his previous demeanor. Dr. Kirkpatrick is making statements that don't seem to be very easily supported by at least known available data. And he's being obviously very dismissive of this subject. That tone, unfortunately, was also present, I think, in AARO's historical report, the long-awaited historical report that, again, like my attitude toward AARO and Dr. Kirkpatrick, as you expressed, Andy, again, I'd been suspending my judgment and just waiting to see what the report said. And I'm sure we're going to talk about that more, so I'll just wrap up this statement by saying that, again, my takeaway from that was unfortunate because it was not impressive. I was not impressed with what AARO called analytical rigor. And unfortunately, I think a lot of the issues that that report were paralleled by and equal to the increasingly dismissive attitude displayed by the former director of AARO. So, I mean, a lot of that really took my hope level from about maybe a 7 or 8, with Tim being high hopes, down to maybe a 2 or 3 or less. So that's kind of where things stand right now.
Yeah, I went from similar to yourself, being hopeful to the feeling I get now going to see a Marvel movie. I'm going to go and see it, but I know I'm going to come out disappointed.
Yeah.
And anything else is, a pleasant surprise. Couple of things then. You mentioned the background dynamics, and I wonder, are you see many folks talk about Sean Kirkpatrick being handled by Susan Goff, who's the Pentagon spokesperson. Do you mean that sort of background dynamic, or just the people behind that even? And I wonder, to expand on that, was Sean Kirkpatrick's appointment by, sinister design, or was he a person appointed to a job to carry out a basic task that maybe along the way got jaded?
It's very hard to say. It could be a complex combination of a lot of those things. Let me address your first question first about, in terms of the kind of mechanism going on behind the scenes that I was alluding to. There was a event that either right around the time he was leaving or maybe right after he had left. It was somewhere right there in that kind of area late last year when it had been announced that Dr. Kirkpatrick was leaving. They just brought on the deputy director, who then almost immediately became at very least, the interim director, Tim Phillips, who is currently still the interim director. I don't think that an official new director of AARO has been named. But at that time, indeed, during this event that was held in Washington, Dr. Kirkpatrick was accompanied by Susan Goff, Pentagon spokesperson, who handles most of the UAP questions. I've, communicated with Susan many times. She's always been very informative, very helpful. I would say 90% of the time she gets right back to me, and I always try to treat her with equal courtesy as well. So all that said, I understand these people are government officials. They have jobs, and many of them do not share the same sort of interest in UAP that we do. I would have to guess that maybe Dr. Kirkpatrick does, but even still, I think that he approaches this from a different world than you or I or your listeners or the listeners of my podcast would, where many of us have studied, publicly available civilian produced UAP literature. We've spoken to people who have observed these objects. I mean, I've talked to countless individuals from over the years, and recently have begun to officially collect reports from people about this with the hope of eventually analyzing them. So my approach to this is, hey, maybe there are some anomalies. Maybe there are some things. Some of these things could also be, experimental military technologies, but let's study these phenomena. Let's apply as much science to it. Let's, apply statistical analysis to this. Let's be, skeptical and discerning, but let's be open to possibilities too. I get it that probably people like Dr. Kirkpatrick with a career in government look at this and they say, okay, first, is there a military concern here? Is there anything that represents a potential danger to the United States, to our assets, to the military, to its operations, to pilots, to aviators, both military and commercial? Is there a potential that this is something that is exploiting information it's collecting about U.S. military operations, and hence why these things are showing up in training ranges? If there are indeed any anomalies, cool. If they don't appear to be trying to track us and trying to interfere with our military operations, if they're not trying to spy on us, but there are technologies and we can't account for these things. At the end of the day, if we just don't know what those things are, we'll say that scientists have to deal with it. If it turns out they're extraterrestrial, we'll give it to NASA and say, okay, guys, turns out this one's in your wheelhouse. That is at least the stated perspective of and the operation of AARO. But I think that the issue is coming to the second part of your question, in terms of there being, machinations and, was Kirkpatrick brought in because he was the guy that they knew would do the best job being dismissive of all this? It's hard to tell whether this was by intent or if this is something that is just a natural process of many individuals, not all, and we could cite historical examples, but many individuals from government or from the sciences and or from both who get involved in UAP studies, they often do become jaded over time. And they may initially approach this with, hopes that there's something phenomenal going on, but those hopes wane with time and with, more and more exposure to, again, what I think skeptics like Mick West would call the low information zone kind of reports that seem to be really extraordinary, but they don't give us anything more than a really good story. And, in the lack of useful data that can be analyzed in that way, I get it. I think a lot of people like Sean Kirkpatrick probably increasingly become skeptical with time. The problem is, though, that with that kind of skepticism, you also start to see a bias emerge. And I think we clearly saw that with Kirkpatrick. There was a bias that was undeniable, and a dismissive tone that furthermore did very little to appeal to people who otherwise might have been supportive of AARO's efforts, yourself and myself included. People who initially might have been, fairly hopeful, cautiously hopeful, I'll say, in terms of what AARO might achieve. By the end, we're all kind of saying, okay, this is just another whitewash. This is Project Blue Book 2.0, and there's a good reason that comparison is made. If you look back at the 1950s and 60s and Project Blue Book, more than an actual evaluation of anomalous phenomena in our skies by the U.S. military, Operation or Project Blue Book, rather, was really a public relations operation. And more importantly, it was an attempt by the U.S. Air Force to control the narrative. In almost every instance, the information that was provided was the kinds of cases that could be easily resolved and determined to be balloons, aircraft, other things like that. They didn't say, here's a good example of one of the cases. We have no idea what this was. It was, multiple witnesses that were military. Scientists were on hand at the time. We had radar scope images. Blue Book never played up those reports for one simple reason. They never would want to convey to the public that there was any kind of a problem, and by problem, not necessarily a threat, but merely something that we can't identify, and that the military can't get a hold on it. It seems evident that with AARO, that tradition is continued. They control the message. They release the cases that they at least claim they can resolve. Recent cases that have been released pretty clearly show to me that they haven't done a good job resolving them. But nonetheless, they are controlling that message. And so in that context, one might argue that this is in a way information warfare. That's the only way I can reconcile AARO's swift designation of resolved case, or case resolution, balloon case resolution, aircraft, like they've been doing amidst this sort of media storm since Kirkpatrick left office. It really, to me, strongly is suggestive of trying to control the message, which is essentially what the military has always done when it comes to official programs involved in this subject.
That's a really good answer. I'm trying to think, and one thing I want to pick out, you mentioned Blue Book and programs, even going back to Roswell and initially announcing they found a saucer and then changing the press release, and then, the story, the cover up, and Blue Book, sign Grudge. In the past, there was no social media. You put out a wire to the press or a report, and a limited number of people saw it. And what the media reported was the story. That was the narrative. There wasn't the same abundance of research. We've got the extreme opposite now, where you have almost too much information available to everyone, including me, including you. There's so much to go through. Social media is awash with all kinds of different narratives, stories. So is it almost easier for AARO to put out this historical report and previous, but in an age where people read headlines? As a journalist, you'll appreciate this. They read a headline. You're lucky if they read the subheadline, and then the body of the content is just dismissed by most folks, and they form an opinion off of 10 or 20 words, on that screen. Is it easy for AARO to dismiss the UAP topic the way they have with this report?
Not only is it easy for AARO to dismiss this topic, it's easier for them to convey to the public that they have all the answers. Let's look at strategic communications on part of the DoD via papers of record, large media sources. Prior to the release of the historical report, there were 7 individuals, each with a respective publication, who were provided an advanced briefing. It wasn't until, I think, Saturday night, late in the evening, when everybody's out getting drunk or watching movies, or working in the garden or whatever it is, that the DoD releases a full transcript of Tim Phillips, acting director, and the briefing that he provided to those outlets. Predictably, we had the New York Times, we had Politico, we had, all these other, big papers, and they all essentially just put out the same story. No evidence of extraterrestrials. There were a couple of programs that were found, but those programs like Kona Blue actually were basically dead in the water, barely even lasted any time. And furthermore, there was this self-licking ice cream cone, as Dr. Kirkpatrick called it. These people who had worked in government, who were very good at convincing themselves and each other of the reality of some kind of a program involving UAP, but really they had just been misinforming each other through circular reporting. This is essentially the narrative that all except for one of those reporters, and again, I always will point this out, Brandy Vincent, writing for Defense Scoop, I think did a great job and always does, and she was the one outlier. The rest of those individuals, they may have actually glanced over the report, but what's plainly evident, Andy, is they didn't fact check it. They didn't bother to look at the details and to actually question the factual merit. They'll fact check everything else, but they don't bother to fact check an official government report that comes from the Pentagon involving UFOs. They left that up to guys like me, Robert Powell from the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. We, of course, had Christopher Mellon write a lengthy piece about that. And just today, as of the time we're recording, we also published a piece there at the DeBrief featuring the perspectives of Mick West, who is saying the same thing. He's saying AARO didn't do a good job on this report. They messed up. Now, look, this is something that all people in the UAP community seem, for the most part, to be agreeing about, that AARO isn't doing the best job that they could. You'd hope that American media would hold them accountable, but they don't. They essentially just present this kind of preferred message. So not only is it good for AARO that people only read the headlines? But again, it's very advantageous to them that there's no fact checking done by the media when it comes to their own work, because people inevitably, I mean, think about this. Very few, I would imagine, outside of serious UFO, interested parties like ourselves, like people out there who are commenting about this and engaging in dialogue on social media. The average person with a passing interest in this, do you think they went and downloaded that report and read all 70 what pages? No, they read, of course, the shortened summary that was provided by the Times or whomever. Maybe if you read the summary provided by the DeBrief, and those readers would know that there were factual inaccuracies in the report. But for those who don't follow this closely, the message that AARO was able to convey allowed them to skip over the report even being read at all. All they had to do is go read the front page of the New York Times and get this very biased, non-fact checked version of the narrative, which is precisely essentially what the DoD wanted. So again, I don't mean in any way to sound like a conspiracy theorist here, because I don't think that to make a good argument that you appeal to conspiracy. Let me be clear, I'm not doing that. What I am outlining is a process, and I think this is a very accurate assessment of it too, in my own personal opinion, and many seem to share this view. This was strategic communication on part of the DoD. We had, if not in terms of being complicit with presenting a certain narrative, we at least had enough laziness on part of the press that it conveyed the correct message the DoD wanted to convey to the public, and thereby it allowed the DoD to escape some responsibility. Had it not been, of course, for those few researchers who have gone through, picked it apart, noticed the wrong dates, the wrong name right here, looked at the bad source material, the wrong source citation, all of these things eventually getting more and more attention clearly show that AARO is not doing the kind of rigorous analytical process that they claim that they're doing. It sadly undermines their efforts, and it does very little to help, instill faith in the American public that those officials who are being appointed to and tasked with studying these phenomena are really doing a good job. I don't think they are. Do you?
No, definitely not. And I think I've gone on a very similar journey to yourself, trying to be positive, seeing some, efforts, reports are going to come out. We're going to have, every couple of months, and then reports ended up being late. We've come to a point going through all of that, like you've covered so well, to these historical reports, one in November, and we are due part two. The Empire Strikes Back is still due to come out for, that initial report.
Yeah.
What are you expecting to see in that second? I think for me, it's more of the same. I know they did mention there was potentially going to be some locations mentioned. There was something else, but I don't think I've got the faith anymore, given it's in a state of flux. We have the interim director who seems to be babysitting long term at the minute. The parents have gone out for the night and spent a long weekend away, it seems, and left the baby with the babysitter. I just don't have faith that part two is going to bear any fruit.
Well, first of all, that's a great analogy that you just gave. I may have to borrow that from you at some point, my friend.
It's yours.
I will also say, though, that again, in fairness, everything I've seen from Tim Phillips is at least a step toward maybe getting back on track. Again, in that briefing that he provided, I don't fault Tim Phillips, the acting director, for going and briefing 7 members of the press in a fairly exclusive press briefing. I'm also aware of the fact that the last kind of publication they're going to come to is one like the DeBrief. They want to go to larger media publications for various reasons, but among those, I'll also acknowledge that those are larger publications. The New York Times, for instance, is a paper of record. Many of those are that were included in that briefing, and to an extent that could be seen as standard practice, but it's also, again, I think, strategic in terms of the fact that, as evidenced by the reporting and the quality of the reporting that emerged as a result of that briefing, the DoD got pretty clearly exactly what they were looking for, with that one exception, Brandy's excellent reporting there at Defense Scoop, where she focused on something that Tim Phillips had said. AARO's working on these gremlin systems. I mean, very few of the other publications said much, if anything, about that. Brandy made that like a focus of her piece because, I mean, what is this? This is a step in the right direction. Here's what AARO is currently doing right now to work toward actually resolving these phenomena, collecting better data about them, rapid deployable systems that may be able to collect more data about these things with various different sensory arrays than anything we currently have. That could really be helpful in terms of resolving UAP. There have been public appearances and statements that Tim Phillips has made too. He seems to be a little more congenial. He seems to have less dismissiveness. in his persona and in his, general attitude. So, I mean, maybe some of those things are hopeful. I'd like to think that maybe that's the direction that AARO is going to go. But again, we'll just have to kind of wait and see. So indeed, I like your analogy there. I think that's pretty accurate too. But if anything, if Tim Phillips continues to do a good job, I mean, I would hope that maybe he will be established as the official director, or they'll bring someone in. Now, as far as, let me just further clarify: bring somebody in who is willing to do two things, who has a deeper interest in this subject and who's willing to look deeply at it, and potentially also is willing to coordinate, maybe where applicable and if able, with civilian components. This is something Mick West and I were talking about recently. Again, if AARO had simply been able to provide that unclassified report to a few people, have them sign NDAs and say, listen, don't release information, but help us go through this report. We want it to be all it can be. Help us fact check this. I know there are some longtime UFO researchers that would have been willing to assist in that capacity. I probably wouldn't have, because again, as a reporter, I also have to be able to report fairly on what they produce. But again, they could have saved themselves a lot of headaches. Now, as far as the other part of your question, coming back to the second report that's forthcoming, I don't know what's going to be in it, but I expect it's probably going to be more of the same. It's going to be probably much shorter. I don't expect there to be any real revelations. I can guarantee you one thing that probably won't be in it that should be in it, though. There should be acknowledgement of all of the errors with a series of corrections and an appendix at very least at the back, but I don't expect to see that.
Yeah. Chris Mellon said back in the days of the UAP task force announcements that, and I think Lou Elizondo backed this up, that they weren't going to have enough time. I think there was a 6-month lead in to have a report, or the first report compiled, thinking back. And they were saying at the time something like 3 to 5 years to set something like this up would be more realistic, just to get it going to a reasonable standard. And also the funding would have to be better. I wonder, one, are we expecting or have expected too much too quick from any office, let alone AARO, to do this kind of job? And like you say, maybe they are taking their time to get better information, better data, work with better equipment, regardless of even being stonewalled trying to find that information. I'd also like to say, the idea that someone else comes in, you mentioned, with more interest or a passion for the UFO topic, I'll play devil's advocate. Could we end up going the other way, where, let's just say, which would be a dream for many, I'm sure, Lou Elizondo gets appointed head of AARO, that there would be a danger that someone with a real passion or enthusiasm, like myself or yourself, might be biased the other way, and you're just getting the polar opposite of lazy explanations, and you start to maybe get too much of a pro UFO UAP spin on it and still not get proper meaty data or results off the back of that.
It's possible, certainly. I mean, again, I think that the issue is that the job of the prospective director of AARO is naturally going to be complicated.
Yeah.
Because it requires something that humans aren't inherently very good at. It requires one to be able to put their biases aside and to truly be able to look at data objectively, and to rely on the opinions of experts from outside your own, personal narrow focus. Back a few centuries ago, a man of science was sort of expected to be somebody who knew a little bit about everything in all of the world of natural philosophy. And by today's standards, we don't have that. I mean, there are generalists. I like to consider myself, although an avocationalist, mostly self-taught in the sciences and everything else for that matter. Nonetheless, I enjoy knowledge, right? I'm a lover of knowledge, and I try to teach myself a little about everything. But as far as professional science, as far as professional, IT, or analysts who work within, the intelligence community, or, people who work in laboratories, whatever, people have to, by virtue of the specificity of their job roles, they have to be specialists. And so these days, what you have is you have groups of people who each individual specializes in different areas, and in different subdisciplines within those subsets, within those areas, and then subsets, even beyond that. Sometimes it gets very granular. For there to be a director of AARO, it has to be a person who, and again, I think Dr. Kirkpatrick did aspire to do this. Having heard him talk about the team that he assembled, he wanted people, a diverse group of people who had different kinds of, analytic and intelligence gathering capabilities. And he wanted to try and put together a team that could look at a case and they could bring all these people together with all these different perspectives. And yet again, nonetheless, you still kind of have a group It's just like any kind of civilian UFO group that brings together a team of people with all these backgrounds. Those people all may be prone towards certain biases. The real difference, I think, with a group like AARO within the United States government looking at potentially classified information is that by virtue of the classified information that they're working with, inherently that information has to be withheld from the public. And so with AARO, what we get is we get a case resolution report every now and then, but a lot of the time we're not allowed to see the actual components behind the scenes. You think about like a computer screen. I can see what's happening on the computer screen. I don't see all the moving parts. I don't see all the different components, all the different systems. I don't know all of the work that went into creating all of the different computer components that allow that screen to produce the image I'm looking at. And looking at an AARO report that's cleared for public release is kind of like that. I see the report, I see their findings, I see some data in terms of the kind of information they use to make those determinations, but I don't see all of the data that they had accessible. And this is something that's really kind of frustrating for researchers out here on the civilian side because it prevents us from being able to fact check their work. And so to an extent, we are prevented from knowing truly how capable these analysts are. I don't doubt that many of them are probably the best of the best in their field. But again, you come back to the human bias factor. You come back to the natural human tendency to avoid certain conclusions or to behave in other ways that sometimes can lead to a less than objective result. And you add to that the problems inherent to classification. I think in truth, fairly, we could say overclassification, because we've heard the Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, talking about this. We've heard others talking about this in recent days, that throughout government, there is this issue with overclassification of information. I would argue that probably some of the classified information that AARO's working with could actually fairly and appropriately be declassified if it weren't for this existing problem, this systemic issue going on in government with overclassification. And if we could move toward reducing the amount of information that has to be deemed classifiable, especially with relation to UAP, but really this again applies more broadly, I think we could potentially get over some of these problems that people have, some of the suspicions, some of the frustrations that civilian researchers have with not being able to fact check their work. But again, that's what I'm trying to emphasize. This is a systemic issue in government right now that many continue to talk about. That would be a necessary first step. And again, I do give props to Dr. Kirkpatrick early on for trying to clear for release some of that data and trying to bring more of that, trying to get some of that data out to the public, like, for instance, common shapes and sizes and things like this with regard to UAP. If you recall, in the original ODNI report from 2021, none of that was even mentioned. Then there was a classified version of the classified report that was partially redacted that was released through a FOIA request to John Greenwald of the Black Vault. John and I had a chat about that, and we were just amazed at how much more information was included, entire separate appendixes in the back of that, classified version of the 2021 report. And yet we couldn't even, be told what the sizes, the random, movements and other characteristics, what the shapes are, the common shapes attributed to these things. There was a whole table in the back with the shapes, and we couldn't even be told, let alone shown examples. And we're all kind of wondering, why is that kind of information classified? Now, AARO did begin to release some of that data. Early on, there was obviously an effort to try and do that. So it's clear that Kirkpatrick and some in AARO were trying to move toward addressing this overclassification issue. But it remains, it persists. It's not just with regard to UFOs. And as long as that issue persists, it's going to be really hard for us to fully understand, I think, the nuances of these investigations. We're left looking at the screen, and we can't see the machine parts going on behind that make that screen work.
I think one of AARO's big misses or open goals was the conversation around whistleblowers who it seemed were being contacted by AARO. I know we heard Robert Salas. We heard part of his conversation he had recorded that he had with AARO. I think that was last year at some point. However, it seems there were many more whistleblowers who were going around AARO and choosing to go straight to others in Congress and the intelligence community and other sources to tell their story, to tell their piece, their evidence. And this caused a bit of an issue, didn't it? A bit of conflict. We've now seen Kirkpatrick and Chris Mellon and David Grusch text messages or signal messages leaking that have It first helped clear up some of the story and then muddied the waters as, that slight detail was off. Oh, he said this, but then it got very messy, as the UFO topic always does. So I want to talk about that whistleblower, because I think for myself and for many in the UFO community, one of the great hopes from last year with the David Grusch coming out and into this year is we are going to hopefully get whistleblowers coming forward. We're hearing numbers up to 40 that are going to come out and break the dam of UFO secrecy. What has your take been as a journalist and researcher, seeing the Grusch story evolve to the point of, having this great hope in David Grusch and others to where we're at now? And I suppose I'll throw the name Jason Sands in there as well, which we'll talk about as to what's happened more recently.
Certainly. So, first of all, when you're reporting on these kinds of developments, you have to try and maintain objectivity. I mean, just like I was talking about any prospective AARO director or anybody who's really, frankly, looking at this subject, a journalist not explicitly related to UAP, really with all things, they should try to maintain balance and objectivity. But again, I acknowledge that's a hard thing for people to do because people tend to form little groups and then they start throwing rocks at each other. These are the good guys and these are the bad guys. That's human nature right there. So when it comes to the whistleblower debate, I have to try and step back sometimes, and I have to try and look at it objectively and say, okay, what's really going on here? When we published that story at the DeBrief last June, right, the original article that broke the David Grusch story by Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal, the story to me was then and is still today that we had a former official from within the United States government, an intelligence community, member, who had filed an official intelligence community inspector general complaint. And that complaint not only had been filed, and there were references to hundreds of pages of classified information, but also it was deemed credible and urgent at that time. Furthermore, there were congressional staffers and others who had knowledge of this individual. They knew that a complaint had been filed. All of this information was verifiable, and it was verified not only by the authors of that piece, but also there was independent verification by my team and I. And very much to my satisfaction, the story was that this man had done all this and that could be verified. Now, naturally, the claims about flying saucers and things that have been captured and that were being, held by the government, and there being a program involved in the recovery of these objects, attributed to non-human intelligences or NHIs, those are extraordinary claims by nature. I mean, they simply are. It doesn't mean that they aren't true. It doesn't mean that they are untrue, but they are categorically extraordinary claims. And so for my own part, the story, again, is still the extraordinary nature of this guy filing a complaint of that nature. And again, filing that officially with the ICIG and it being deemed credible and urgent. But of course, I think a lot of people tend to kind of look at this whole whistleblower debate and they say, well, you're either with David Grusch and he's an American hero, or you're against him and you're a detractor type person or something along those lines. And people do tend to kind of stratify into those two camps. So let's talk about the recent FOIA release. Yet again, this release to John Greenwald of the Black Vault, who does, extraordinary work being able to get this information and make it publicly available to people so that we can see these, inner workings of certain things going on in government, especially amidst these classification issues that I was addressing earlier. These FOIA documents released to him primarily dealt with two things. There was a memorandum of record that describes attempts by AARO to communicate with David Grusch with the intent of bringing him in to have him provide an official disclosure on the record with regard to information that he provided to the ICIG in June. What these communications that are attachments with that memorandum of record that were released to John in the FOIA request also entail are email communications. And then there are screenshots of signal communications between, we had Chris Mellon and Dr.Sean Kirkpatrick communicating. Chris Mellon attempting to try and, help facilitate dialogue between Grusch and Kirkpatrick. Now, I'll note again in those signal communications, what they seem to show, just a clean read on this. Just if I didn't know these two individuals, right, and I'm just reading what they said, it really makes Chris Mellon seem like a very friendly, approachable person who's trying to help. Dr. Kirkpatrick comes across seeming very irritable. I think it's fair to say he does not seem like he's enjoying those communications. He's very antagonistic and even accusatory toward Chris Mellon at times, where Chris is saying, I'm trying to help you get this guy in to talk with you. Dr. Kirkpatrick essentially accuses Mr. Mellon of obstructing that process and doing the exact opposite of the thing that he claims that he's trying to do. As far as who came out looking better from that exchange being released, I'll leave that up to the listeners. I have my own personal opinion on that. But to me, looking at the more pertinent, aspect of this, which involves what do those communications between AARO investigators and Grusch indicate? Clearly, it shows that Grusch had concerns about going and talking with AARO. It shows that Grusch did not go to talk to AARO. It shows that at one point he had a meeting scheduled and he stood up the AARO investigators, didn't show up, and then he later writes back and he apologizes for what he characterizes as confusion about his whereabouts. But again, he said, I should have been more specific or clear in expressing my concerns in my previous email from, aforementioned date, where he continues to say that he has concerns about what information he can provide to AARO. Mm-hmm. Now, many have said, the Pentagon has clarified, Dr. Kirkpatrick has said, and it was apparently expressed to Mr. Grusch, that AARO, by virtue of being the designated authority at the direction of Congress, as was outlined in the 2022 NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act, AARO is the office that is supposed to be able to release or is supposed to be able to receive UAP information. The problem has to, and I think this is an important point that very few people have really acknowledged with all this. At the time, in fact, just weeks before Grusch came forward and again, that story really became topic A, not just in UAP. It was the huge story for several weeks, all around the world, and all the major media outlets, talking about that after the debrief broke that story. Dr. Kirkpatrick only weeks earlier had been in this Senate hearing with Kirsten Gillibrand and had said to her, it would be helpful if AARO could get Title 50 authority. In other words, the ability to receive certain information from the intelligence community that presumably AARO didn't have access to at that time. Many of us have continued to wonder about that. Did or does AARO have Title 50 authority? That's also addressed somewhat in the communications between Dr. Kirkpatrick and Chris Mellon, where at that point, Kirkpatrick is saying that there are essentially some limitations, particularly in regard to what information can be exchanged. But again, there's nothing, he says, that blocks AARO from being able to receive UAP information. I sought further clarification on that following the release of the historical report. And so I reached out to the Pentagon. The Pentagon spokesperson, Sue Goff, who we mentioned earlier, said to me again that AARO, as the official authority by law, has the ability to receive all information related to UAP. Now, you'd think that is, again, she's reiterating, I guess, what has already been known. Okay, you guys are cleared for receiving all UAP information. But to me, that still leaves a lot of questions. If it's Title 50 authority that they have, why not say, yes, unequivocally, AARO has Title 50 authority, and they can receive that information. Now, let's get back to those emails for a second. If you read what Grusch is saying, look, there are elements related to things that I know about UAP that are not explicitly related to UAP. They have relationship to other programs, which you, AARO, do not have the authority to be able to receive. And therefore, my concern is that if I provide that information to you, either you guys might get in trouble or I might be held accountable, I could be arrested, or both. At one point, Grusch even says, can you guys not go to the Intelligence Community Inspector General and see if they'll provide you a copy of my complaint? Had this been, again, deemed something that AARO could receive by the ICIG, it would have removed Grusch completely from the whole situation. It would have provided the information to AARO, but it would have removed the possibility that Grusch was breaking the law and making those disclosures to AARO, if there was anything AARO shouldn't have been able to receive. Now, again, AARO researchers, or investigators, I should say, and I think even Dr. Kirkpatrick have continually said that, yes, AARO can receive this information, Grusch, we just need you to come talk to us. This isn't, and this is also important, this isn't just Grusch operating in a vacuum here. We also have David Grusch receiving counsel from, again, a gentleman, by the way, Chuck McCullough, who had previously worked in the ICIG himself. I've met Mr. McCullough. He is a highly respected individual in terms of his authority, in terms of his knowledge with regard to these legal matters. If McCullough is providing this information to Grusch, Certainly, I would imagine that that is because he feels like Grusch seems to, that there were concerns and relevant ones about what information could legally be conveyed to AARO. Now, again, another point, though, that I think we really should drive home is that all of this was happening shortly after Grusch had made those revelations, and we have, of course, first reported that News Nation had done an interview with him, and this story had really broken at that point. This is all weeks after we had Dr. Kirkpatrick sitting there talking with Kirsten Gillibrand, expressing that they didn't have Title 50 authority. So at that point, based on the understanding that virtually all of us had, and based on exactly what Kirkpatrick had said during that Senate hearing, I mean, Grusch seems to have been operating on that understanding. When he said that he needed additional clarity, he says that he was never given that. In his most recent statement, now fast forwarding to just a few days ago, the statement he provided to News Nation, Grusch has further said that it's never been clarified for him whether indeed he can provide that level of information, sensitive information, to AARO. And until he gets that clarification, he says that he still has concerns about going and speaking with them. I think obviously that he should go talk to AARO, but there needs to be some clarification about this. And my concern is that there's going to be this kind of, stalemate where Grusch is going to keep saying, I don't know if this is safe for me to do. AARO's going to keep saying, we can receive all the information. Yeah, but specifically what information? All of it related to UAP. And that's never going to satisfy Grusch. But unfortunately, it does seem that part of the debate now has started going in this direction where, well, if he won't go talk to Grusch, then maybe there was never anything to his complaint at all. Maybe Grusch is just a phony. Maybe there never were any real revelations. Yet again, I feel that people are just getting entirely binary in this. Either there's everything to what Grusch said and the whole, fate of humankind in the future rests on what he said, or there's nothing to it at all. I don't think it's quite so simple as that. And again, this is why I've tried to very objectively look at these communications. And it seems clear to me that based on what everyone's understanding of AARO's capabilities in terms of what it could receive from the intelligence community at that time, and that again reflective of Sean Kirkpatrick's own public statements, I think that Grusch was justified in having those concerns. He says he still wants further clarity on this. I hope that he can be given that. But ultimately, I'd like to see him go talk to AARO and be able to make an official disclosure.
Yeah, I can't disagree with that, and I think you're spot on. And this isn't to be pro or anti David Grusch. For the record, I'm very pro David Grusch and what he came out and said,
Sure.
and what he could potentially still bring forward. That's, if you're a UFO person, that's the gold mine, isn't it? That's the jackpot. Wow, the guy's talking about craft, biologics, the programs, the satellite imagery. It's everything. It's the David Grusch movie would be the ultimate alien UFO movie. He is, the whistleblower. However, do you think it's shown? I think, like you say, it's not binary, it's not black and white. And the more detail that comes out, there are so many nuances people pick over. And this is where being honest, I'll not lose interest, but I struggle to get to that fine granular detail of, if you look, David Grusch at 4:57 said this in his statement. However, that's not quite correct, because at 3:15 the day before, what he said was this, but then someone else comes in and corrects that and says, Micah, but at 4:12, what had happened was this communication and this. I get lost in that level of detail. And I know for many that's incredibly important. But for me, I like to take a step back and look more high level at these kind of things. Segueing into that, though, we've seen, I think, a very good example of how David Grusch has come forward. Clearly highly intelligent, regardless of what he does or has done in his official capacity. The guy isn't stupid. He is so eloquent in how he speaks, very deliberate in how he speaks. On the flip side of that, we've had Jason Sands come forward, who appears to be the next whistleblower in line. It looks like he was due to be in James Fox's next documentary called The Program. I believe at the moment it's still the title, if not the working title. That was due to be finished around late April, May time. There was a clipboard released of Jason Sands being on one of those, snap, take two, with James Fox ready to interview. Cutting a long story short, Jason Sands seemed to decide himself to come out on UFO X or UFO Twitter in a 5-hour Twitter space, and then divulge as much as he could on Twitter, on social media. Have we seen the two extremes of the impact a whistleblower can have, both good and bad, but also how not to conduct yourself in this kind of arena?
Well, that's a very good question. First, I'll speak about the recent, the coming out, the coming forward, and the revelations of Mr. Sands. In my perspective on that here in a moment, just because I did listen to almost that entire 5 hours. I mean, it's a lot to have to kind of go through, but I did, and I took notes because that's what I try to do. But before I get to that, I do want to just kind of mention that, to your point. Again, a lot of people do hang on every word that is said by the whistleblowers, or they are very, very, opinionated about all of that and what the government's real intentions are. For me, I mean, as a reporter, I have to follow this, and I do follow it because I'm interested in this subject, and I've followed it for a long time. But again, very much to your point, those aren't the most important things to me. They are of relevance. They certainly are, and that's why I'm getting so granular with my own, breakdown that I'm trying to provide, because I think, especially if somebody like yourself, who I respect, is going to ask those questions, I want to give you the best and most objective interpretation that I can. But at the end of the day, we often forget that there are these anomalous phenomena that people have reported seeing for decades, and that we could be applying science toward that. We could be doing statistical analysis. The social sciences could be more involved in all this. This is something that really should be studied. And we're so hung up on controversies and claims and conspiracy theories and things along those lines, that to me truly detract away from the more relevant and important study. And so I do hope that, at the end of the day, the whistleblower stuff is important. It's great. But let's not forget about the phenomena that should be studied. So all that said, coming back to your question, I listened to the entire dialogue that was provided by Mr. Sands, and a couple of background points on this. First, Mr. Sands' name was known to me prior to his appearance online. In fact, I know several people who know him and think very highly of him. I attended a meeting in Washington, D.C. It was a very informal gathering with people who were both interested in UAP and some who had also, assisted some of the past government efforts and things along these lines. It was more of a kind of a social gathering among people who really are interested in this. And Mr. Sands was supposed to be at that event, but was unable to be there because of other obligations. It had nothing to do with me being there that he wasn't able to attend, but I'd hoped to be able to meet him and talk to him because I had already had some degree of foreknowledge of the kinds of claims that Mr. Sands was making. Then when he made the appearance on the Twitter Spaces the other night, and I think that it was also live streamed on Spaced Out Radio, and then there was audio that was uploaded thereafter. I listened to the replay, we might say, on one of the YouTube uploads, and I took notes. I never want to sound like I'm disparaging of a person who's willing to come forward and talk about things that they say that they know from their time in government. And I don't know, what to make of some of Mr. Sands' claims, apart from the fact that, very much like we would say of some of the things that David Grusch had been talking about, they are, by their very nature, extraordinary claims. That doesn't mean that they aren't necessarily true. It simply means that in terms of our consensus reality and our current understanding of the world, physics, space, astronomy, the search for extraterrestrial life, et cetera, we would, and scientists, I think, would define a lot of those claims as extraordinary. Now, I'll just tell you this, as being a self-admitted UFO geek. Okay, I'm a person who's read read about this topic for many years, and I'm very well aware of the potential for disinformation and the distinction between that and misinformation, which is, again, misinformation might just be that somebody gets bad information, they unknowingly convey that to others, and it's propagated because it's written in a book or an article or something along those lines. Misinformation can result from disinformation. Disinformation, I think, is when you put intent behind the injecting of bad information into a situation. And let's be very clear. There are instances in the past where that has been done, and it is suspected that it is originated from within the United States government, various agencies, for the purpose of directing the conversation, confusing the dialogue, detracting, or maybe more appropriately, misdirecting information or ideas or attention away from certain ideas toward other ideas. And this is something that sometimes is helpful for national security. There are other reasons why disinformation occurs too. And it doesn't just explicitly happen with UAP. It's something we're currently dealing with in the geopolitical landscape right now. Yep. Listening to Mr. Sands, I'll just say this. I had some concerns based on several things that he said, which seemed to be references to either fictitious groups, organizations, vestiges of UFO folklore, or other such things, some of them also probably fictitious, but related to disinformation. And I can't tell whether what he is saying is disinformation or if he is someone who is interested in this subject and he is citing a lot of references to things that may have been linked to disinformation in the past. Whatever the outcome is, I don't know. And I'm not judging Mr. Sands. I don't know him personally. I'd still maybe at some point like to talk to him. I know others that think very highly of him, and that, again, his military background, his own career, and his credentials can be verified. But I have a lot of concerns about some of the things I've heard him say that to me are very different from the kind of language and the demeanor I have seen, again, by Mr. Grusch when speaking under oath, the care, the caution that he exhibits in terms of the way that he phrases things, references that he makes to certain programs and things along those lines. I see a lot of differences there. And so in my personal opinion, as always, I'll suspend judgment, but I'm taking notes, I'm watching, and I'm eager to see where this goes, albeit currently a little concerned with some of the most recent whistleblower claims.
Yep. Again, I think we're in a very similar place, Micah. That may be boring for some people, but with Jason Sands, Mr. Sands, I'd love to speak to him. I did try and reach out to see if he would come on the podcast just to speak through some of those claims, his background, his story. I look forward to see if James does indeed include him in his documentary. I think there's still a place for that. It seems he is who he says he is. Very much so that there may be a mix of opinion and learned UFO lore in with his story. And I think what it's done for me is open my eyes to, we've been so fixated on these 40 whistleblowers and that it's going to be David Grusch after David Grusch after David Grusch coming forward, speaking eloquently, speaking well, very well prepared. And I think that's part of David Grusch's character and demeanor, his background. He was in a job for that reason, the way he presents himself and can present himself. Maybe Jason Sands doesn't have that same innate ability, which is very difficult to do. That's why David Grusch was doing what he was doing. Should we expect then a range of people across this group of whistleblowers where we're going to get some folks who maybe less than credible, and that's not a dig at Jason Sands, but that there's a possibility. We get folks who maybe aren't as capable at speaking publicly as we would like. But then on the other hand, you do get some folks who worked on the craft, worked on the bodies, who are comfortable speaking publicly in classified and unclassified settings. For me, it's reset my expectation as to what 40 whistleblowers may bring forward. Where do you sit with that in this group?
Well, obviously everybody's different. We'll just acknowledge that. I think it was George Orwell that had written about how, especially when it comes to politics, political language is a different kind of a language. You don't necessarily have to be eloquent to be charismatic. You don't necessarily have to be well informed to be able to convince people. Some politicians are extremely well informed and they aren't very charismatic. Some are less informed, but they are very charismatic people, and therefore they are very influential, right? And I think politics is a good example because, again, every now and then, whether it's whistleblowers with alleged knowledge of UAP programs and things within government, or people who in the civilian sector claim to have seen a UFO, there are people who, by nature, they don't go seeking attention. They don't go seeking celebrity. They're calm, they're rational, and they may talk about extraordinary things, but they aren't really charismatic people, right? Which one might say is in some ways actually appealing. It could, under the right circumstances, actually contribute to their overall credibility, right? Mm. Whereas you've got some speakers, people who are, they are very charismatic. They carry themselves with a noble demeanor. And they look, they act, they sound credible, and yet they may not be deemed credible, right? For various reasons. For me, again, you have to be wary of allowing a person's demeanor, how nice they are, how sincere they seem, their willingness to look you in the eye and to tell you, I'm being honest, I'm not lying to you right now. You have to overlook all that, and you have to listen to what they're saying. And again, as a journalist, one has to fact check. One has to say, okay, let's test the merit based on the claims that are made. This is an extraordinary claim. Can you back this up? Is there anything that corroborates this information? When we look at any of the range of different things that are coming out, because let's just face it, some of the whistleblowers have already come forward, right? One example I'll give, Michael Herrera, right? He's already appeared on Sean Ryan's podcast, numerous other podcasts. I think he's going to be on my friend Martin Willis's podcast here soon. And he is also referenced, not by name, but the account that he has provided publicly already is referenced in the AARO historical report. Now, Mr. Herrera's claims are again, they're somewhat extraordinary, we might say, because they seem to involve an anomalous vehicle. And yet there are these elements to the way he tells his story that certainly bring it down to earth in a very real sense. Black Ops guys coming out, holding them hostage. I can't gauge whether the story is true or not, but I can say that when I listen to Mr. Herrera tell that story, it sounds very credible. It seems like a very accurate retelling of events. I've listened to numerous different retellings on different podcasts and things now, and I don't find too many discrepancies in the way he tells the fundamental story. It's a very interesting story. And so I wonder if indeed there are others like Mr. Herrera who are willing to come forward, and to what extent they can, again, with national security in mind and classification, NDAs, all this stuff in mind. I'm interested to see if there are others who will come forward and talk about similar things. Because if you look at what Mr. Herrera says, I mean, just looking at that objectively, he doesn't say there were little gray guys with big black eyes walking around or anything along those lines. He's saying there were black op dudes, some really anomalous kind of a, saucer kind of or pyramidal kind of a craft sort of thing. They were loading pallets onto this. There were black, vehicles and things along these lines. And he further says that he's found that this is related to some really kind of dark and dangerous stuff. I mean, that to me could go one of two ways. Some might call that a conspiracy theory. Others might say, I don't know, that sounds like a better explanation for a lot of this stuff than little green men from, Zeta Reticuli or whatever. So, but in any case, it's going to be really interesting if other people come forward and let's say maybe they are sharing similar things. I'll add to that this too. If you look at some of the statements in the AARO historical report, Dr. Kirkpatrick and the other presumed authors and investigators who were involved with it, they specifically say in the report, there were certain programs that we found, that we learned that, and in fact, I'll also mention that Tim Phillips mirrored this himself in the briefing he provided to the press prior to the publication of the report. But again, AARO says some of these programs, we wouldn't fault people from necessarily thinking that these things were UAP related if they didn't know what these phenomena or technologies or things were. Again, I think about some of the other whistleblowers that had appeared on Sean Ryan's podcast and that have appeared in other kinds of mediums and venues. It sounds an awful lot to me like people may have observed some technological breakthroughs that, again, AARO makes the illusion in their own report that, yeah, some of this stuff is kind of ours, wink, wink, and people, if they saw it and they didn't know what they were looking at, they weren't read into that program, they couldn't be faulted for thinking this was otherworldly tech, but we didn't find evidence of that. That's what AARO is saying. That's one interpretation. Let me be clear. It's an interpretation of the narrative, or maybe a part of the narrative that is emerging from what we already know from some of the whistleblowers who have come forward, that there is some really exotic looking stuff, but it's ours. And some of the people who provided their testimony to AARO were describing this. And AARO claims, again, that they went and they looked and they found what these programs were. They were able to receive that information. It wasn't what many of these people perceived it as being at the time, but that didn't mean that they were wrong with what they saw. And that's, again, another very important point that I think is often overlooked in this whole debate. People were so narrow focused on their, show me the bodies, show me the biologics, show me the extraterrestrials and their craft, the NHI. But AARO has basically come out and said in very veiled language, look, we found evidence of the kinds of things that people are describing having seen, and it's essentially all our stuff. But we don't fault them for being wrong about that, because some of this stuff really is pretty extraordinary. I mean, that's all but said in the report. So that may not be the entire mystery, but that is certainly a component of it. And that's, to me, maybe one of the biggest revelations with regard to all this, and perhaps some additional information about some of those technologies, systems, and other things will be a part of what the whistleblowers begin to talk about. But again, I think that to your question, what many are hoping to see is additional details about the exotic stuff, if it exists. Again, I think Chris Mellon makes a very good argument that if AARO is a subordinate office, right, within the DoD, if they're going to go looking for that stuff and their investigations are essentially this, hey, do you guys have any NDAs that might have, threatened people if they knew about this stuff? You guys got any flying saucers in there? Are they really going to be provided that information? Information that pertains, working as a hypothetical here, to potentially the biggest secret of all time that any government has ever withheld from any group, any public group. Is a subordinate office within the DoD going to be capable of bringing that truth to the public? What would be the impact if they did? What would be the outcome? I mean, is there going to be societal collapse? Are people going to be freaking out? Again, there are a lot of reasons we might presume that certain information either was not found by AARO or it was not released. But I think that too is another component of the bigger mystery, some of which has already been alluded to in the whistleblower allegations that AARO's own report describes.
Micah, it's never been an issue for me that a large number, and I'll go, let's say 70% to throw a number out there, of sightings by the military, personnel, these reports coming in could well be misidentifications or top secret black budget US tech, Chinese tech being encountered, Russian tech being encountered. But there's still going to be a percentage, and a sizable percentage, like you say, that is the stuff we want to know about. Something that isn't ours, isn't theirs, it's something else's. And that's the stuff, obviously, that interests you, interests me, interests the listeners. And even of that 70%, like you say, if Michael Herrera's story, for example, there is this incredible craft, but it seemed to be human, soldiers, black ops guys coming out of it. Where's that tech from? Where's this generational, multi-generational leap in technology came from?
Good question.
Did you get that from elsewhere? Because that's not, let's say, Jeremy Corbell's pyramids, pyramids that were seen, allegedly, the bokeh story from back in the day. There's still a lot of testimony Jeremy talks about that says those were pyramids flying in the air. So is it a case of the US come out and say, you caught us, this was something that shouldn't have been encountered, these flying pyramids are ours, sorry, yep, we'll hold our hands up. The next question is, okay, when did you start developing flying pyramids? Where did you get the tech from? Are you using anti-gravitics? Where's the propulsion? Same with the Tic Tac. All that kind of stuff just leads to more and more questions, which it's a whole other conversation, I think, in podcasting. I want to start wrapping up at least the AARO Kirkpatrick whistleblower part of this. A couple of things to bring things up to speed, because I think we've done, or you have done here, you've done all the work, Micah, a really nice summary of AARO, where it's come from, where it's been, where it might be going. Sean Kirkpatrick is on somewhat of a post-AARO media tour, his kind of farewell tour as he sails off into the private contractor sunset. I've reached out to Sean Kirkpatrick a few times and spoken to him a few times personally. He's very cordial. I've invited him on the podcast. He's never said no, full stop. But I'm always getting, pushed down the line to a time he can or would be able to, which is fair enough. It's probably just a way of saying no long term. But he does seem friendly with certain outlets, including the New York Post, which on the 8th of May is running a story, I think, through Stephen Greenstreet. I, in my head, can imagine what this piece is going to be, what it's going to sound like. And I think just from looking at social media, many others have the same. I'll still check it out, as I'm sure many others will as well. Stephen produces things really well. Obviously, he's on the side of the UFO fence that I'm not, you're not, and many of the listeners and viewers of this podcast won't be. But each to their own. What do you think of Sean Kirkpatrick in this farewell tour? Does it really just cement where he is in his UFO belief?
Well, first of all, I hope he will join you on your podcast. Although I have publicly on numerous occasions aired professional criticisms, again, I mean him no animus. I mean, it's not a intent of mine to try and tear him down as an individual or anything like that. I mean, I'll acknowledge that some of the communications that have been released via FOIA do not necessarily paint him in the best light. And in fact, again, that's one more reason I hope that maybe he'll do an interview with you. Perhaps he will join me on my podcast. I would love to talk to Dr. Kirkpatrick. In fact, he works now at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, which is just about 2 hours from me here in Asheville, North Carolina. I would love to sit down and have a coffee with the guy. And again, I know that there are certain people out there in UFO world who are really angry when they hear that. How dare you say you'd have a coffee with that man, Micah? But again, as a journalist, I would very much like to talk to him. I'd very much like to talk to him as much as any of the other kinds of government officials who I've spoken with, who have worked on past UAP programs and, who've had certain degrees of involvement with current ones. That all said, I think that what has been called the media tour. I'm not surprised that the aforementioned commentator, the video editor that you referenced there, I'm not surprised that Dr. Kirkpatrick's going to be making an appearance on his podcast, because again, here we have a pretty biased presentation on this subject. And I do think that in light of that bias, that what Kirkpatrick, his expectations and his personal views align more with that bias, perhaps maybe than you or I. But I have no doubts that you or I would and hopefully will be fair with him if he ever consents to give an interview, because I'd like to talk to him. I'd like to give him an opportunity. Hey, man, can you clarify some of these issues for us? Can you speak to this? Help me understand some of the details here. From your experience as director, how could AARO improve what it does? What could you have done better? What do you hope your successor will do differently from what you've done? Those are all good questions. And, I think he deserves an opportunity to be able to speak to those points, because there are a lot of issues, and that's abundantly clear at this point. But in terms of the, and this is a concern I have, in terms of the media tour, if we look at the outlets that, Kirkpatrick has spoken with, if we look at the publications that he has written for, I mean, it really makes a lot of sense that Scientific American would be the vehicle for him communicating personally through op-eds to the public, more so than the DeBrief. In a way, I would hope that he would publish something with someone like the DeBrief, though, because I try to show both sides of the argument, right? We don't want to just be featuring commentary from, the Chris Mellons and the people who are kind of on that side of the debate. I would want to be able to showcase both of those perspectives, but also to do so critically, objectively, right? And in a discerning way. Now, all that said, I totally understand why he would rather go right for Scientific American, and how that makes him look in terms of, the way that the audience that he is speaking to receives the information he's providing. But then we go a little deeper and we look at, for instance, one of the first notable interviews that he did was with Peter Bergen, the Pentagon expert with CNN.
Yeah.
Again, it was a very friendly interview. I suspect that the forthcoming interview that's going to be appearing in the next day or so is going to be a very friendly interview that won't challenge Dr. Kirkpatrick on certain points. And so I think that the issue there is that it seems to me that it is strategic communication that is occurring, where Dr. Kirkpatrick is presenting the narrative very much in the same way that the DoD presented the narrative at the time of the release of the historical report. Select outlets were briefed. Predictably, those outlets presented their coverage in a way that aligned with the DoD's overarching narrative, with no effort to kind of fact check or to draw questions about any inaccuracies and things in that report. It's evident that Kirkpatrick is essentially doing the same sort of thing. He's working with publications, outlets, individuals that are going to be more likely to align with his narrative, cater to it, and help to proliferate a certain narrative that, even though he's no longer working with AARO, is still in line with AARO's overall objectives. That, to me, sounds a lot like strategic communication. Some, if they were to use more, a term, for instance, might come to mind like information warfare, right? You could employ that kind of terminology, but again, I'll just stick with strategic communication. It is communication that is attempting to achieve a certain goal. All communication tries to do that, but in this case, it's clear that there's a certain narrative being delivered to people who are receptive of that narrative that will help to propagate that, so that that can be the official public record. And it leaves a lot of holes in terms of accountability and attempts by those who would have maybe more critical perspectives on some of these issues, like yourself or me.
Yeah, no, that's very fair. And I'd like to think, in any walk of life, I've said this a few times on the podcast, Micah, you should be able to sit and speak to someone who has wildly different opinions on any range of subjects to you, and you're allowed to talk to them, be friendly, be cordial, and at the end of the conversation, either you've only strengthened your own opinions you had that were right in the first place, you might learn a little bit of something and take something from them to say, do you know what, 90% of what you said I still don't agree with, however, I see where you're coming from, I'll take this on board, maybe this will change some part of my opinion, maybe it will, maybe it won't. Hell, you could flip completely and go, do you know what, based on what you've said, how you've presented it, then yeah, I'm on board. I'm going with that now. Have a fluid opinion, but people shouldn't be scared of entertaining those kind of conversations. And I've cited this many times before, totally unrelated to UAP. one of the best things I watched in the last couple of years, because I like to sometimes watch different interviews and how they come across and techniques and whatnot.
Yeah.
And it was Ben Shapiro and Russell Brand, who are two incredibly different people. And that's what attracted me to the interview, to see those two guys speaking. Russell Brand, we all know Russell Brand's background, you know, party boy in the past, drug addict at one point.
Yeah.
Then he became a guy who could afford his drugs, which is completely different. They're called celebrities. And, you know, carved out quite the career for himself. And then you've got Ben Shapiro, who I know less about, but I've got a good idea of him from viral clips and whatnot. Very religious, politically very right-wing, I believe, Republican leaning, all that kind of stuff. And they had a chat about how they completely disagree with each other, but it was incredibly interesting to hear different viewpoints, which I thought was great. And I wish you could see more of that in the UFO arena. But there's so many bubbles separating all these conversations. Do
Well,
you want to come in on that?
yes, if you don't mind, if I could just interject, I would say perhaps unnecessarily. For instance, you know, a while back I had Whitley Strieber on my program, and I don't actually consider him somebody that fundamentally I really disagree with. I think that the point I'm making is that many would say, you know, Micah, you being a journalist who looks at a lot of these, you know, phenomena and talking about applying science toward it and really studying the aspects of the phenomena that science can be applied toward, it's interesting to have an experiencer on your podcast like Whitley. First of all, I've always enjoyed his writing. I mean, ever since I was a teenager. And entirely apart from the whole UAP thing, as a person who at one time wanted to be a novelist, and today, you know, because I'm not a good novelist, I'm not a good fiction writer, I write, you know, in a journalistic fashion, I still admire the art of writing, right? One of my favorite books of all time is Stephen King's book on writing, a memoir on the craft. And you know, whether it's writing about UFOs or it's you know, writing about, you know, thrillers or apocalypse kind of scenarios, apocalyptic themes like a War Day. I've enjoyed Whitley's writing. But Whitley, I also just find to be a person who, when I come away from a conversation with him, you know, it causes me to think outside the box. There's an abstract area that those kinds of conversations occupy that I think as humans we sort of need. You know, that's a healthy thing.
Yeah.
And so I find those kinds of conversations to be extremely beneficial. And some of my very closest friends in this world are people who claim very, you know, otherworldly things. They claim to have had very unique experiences. And sometimes they'll remark to me, they'll say, you know, Micah, you're a really strict, just the facts kind of scientific thinker. It's interesting that you sort of interface with those areas that border the known, right?
Yeah.
And that really push the boundaries of really what science can even understand. I think that's what draws me to those. Being such a, you know, scientific, logical kind of a thinker, I'm drawn to the really weird stuff. And that doesn't mean that I necessarily believe all of it, but I'm attracted to it, almost kind of like opposites attract, because I think indeed it gives me this different perspective on things, you know, apart from the logical kind of, you know, rational worldview that I have and that world that I operate in. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. You know, and if you enjoy getting that from reading comic books or horror novels, or you like watching movies, or you like to go talk to people who inspire you to think outside the box like I do, I mean, I think humans kind of need that. And I think that, again, apart from any kind of UAP narrative, sometimes just speaking with people who have a different worldview, politically, religiously, sociologically, you know, or whatever else. Historically, you know, you could sit down and you can have a conversation with somebody that you don't agree with, but you will almost inevitably come away from it having learned something. So, yes, I definitely wish that more in the UAP community would do that, be open to hearing other people's perspectives, and be a little more conscious of how easily we stratify and how we tend to fall into these camps. You know, it's us versus them. You either support this person and their crazy claims, or you support this person and their seemingly extraordinary claims, right? This person, if I don't agree with what they say, then they must be a liar. They're wrong. I have to fight them and attack them. Nonsense. Step back. Remember, these are all human behaviors. Stop, breathe, and listen once in a while. That would probably help a lot of us.
Yeah, I'm with you on guests like Whitley, who's been on the podcast quite recently, can be really divisive. any experiencers, people like to say the spiritual, the woo, I'll have listeners get in touch to say, I tapped out after 20 minutes, still love the podcast, but this wasn't for me. And that's fine. I'll get the same number of folks who'll get in touch and say, wow, I listened to this multiple times. I've had that experience. I've had these beings, appear in my room. I've had shadow figures. I've had premonitions and I've never experienced that. So I can't relate, but I can appreciate where they're coming from. So you can get very polarizing views, whether people like this for information, entertainment, infotainment, whatever it may be, just background noise. That's fine. And it's such a wide-ranging topic, and as things bleed into each other, it can be really striking as to what's accord with people and what doesn't. That brings me to, let's jump out of AARO for a moment to something that has been incredibly, I was surprised how divisive this was, namely on the YouTube comments, to be honest, with the Nazca Mummies that have been in the news, and they've not gone away. And I am about to get some more guests on to talk about this from various perspectives, because it seems to be something people still want to talk about. Again, really polarizing, Micah. We've got people who are firmly in the camp of these are genuine specimens, non-human intelligences have been discovered on this planet, mummified. These are the real deal. Why aren't more people talking about them? We have a camp in the middle who are always going to be there going, I don't know, I'm waiting to be convinced either way. And then you've got folks who are very much, this is ridiculous, this is nonsense, don't like the way it's being presented. I'll hold my hand up to that one. I've been really honest, and I don't believe these to be genuine, but I'm sure would like to be pleasantly surprised given the nature of the topic they like. What are your thoughts on this whole Nazca Mummies, Peru Mummies situation with Jaime Maussan and co?
Yeah. So that does remain a rather contentious debate. And, I've upset a lot of people because on my podcast, I have repeatedly said that I don't think that there is likely to be a there. But I think, like you said, Andy, I would love to be convinced otherwise. But I would need to see the evidence, right? David Spergel, during the NASA independent study team's, issuance of their report, which really didn't have any findings with regard to UAP, just a bunch of advice that they gave to people about how NASA might help with the study of it. But I mean, Spergel was asked during that press conference about those. And rather than saying, this is nonsense, I think he made a very reasonable scientific response. If those things are real, and I'm paraphrasing, by the way, but again, if these things are real, let scientists look at those, let them be studied. If they're the discovery of the century that blows this whole thing wide open and it settles the entire NHI debate for us, there's a way, there's a process, a very clear and definitive one that would settle that debate. But we haven't done that yet. That hasn't occurred. And again, some would try to say that there are powers that be that are preventing that. But unfortunately, I think that what's more likely, given some of the parties involved with this and some of their history, I think what's far more likely is that there's been control by other parties, i.e., those who are hoping to try and present this information in a way that benefits them more so than it benefits humankind. Again, whether it's an alien body or it's a crashed flying disc or it's anything else, potential extraterrestrial probe that maybe crashed, someplace, let scientists look at that. This is something that to me goes beyond defense, and it goes beyond all those kinds of, political issues these days and military issues. It has to do with the greatest question of all time, right? Which is funny because really many would say, paradoxically, the greatest question, are we alone in the universe, doesn't even necessarily have to do with humans. And yet it would be the most probably important discovery humans ever made, but probably because it doesn't involve us. So that should be a question for science. That's my position. I don't think that's an unreasonable position. If those bodies are real, if they represent anything otherworldly, or for that matter, if there's something cryptoterrestrial and they're from right here on Earth, an unknown, human-like species or humanoid species, let scientists look at it. Let them make that determination. And there are many people who keep saying, maybe these things are real, they are the real deal. Well, that's great. But until scientists have independently confirmed that, and there's been a peer review process and a paper has been published, unfortunately, whatever processes or practices or individuals may impede us from getting to that point, the reality remains that we don't know what those things are because science hasn't been able to make that determination. That's what science is. That's why we have that process. We have that toolkit that will allow us to make those kinds of determinations. And in the absence of those determinations being made, I'm a little less than on the fence. I remain unconvinced about those. But prove me otherwise, prove me wrong. Now, again, as I have had people reach out in the past, I'm sure there will be some now who will say, as others have, you've lost me. The minute you started saying you don't believe in those mummies, you lost me. You lost me as a listener, Hanks. To which I'll simply say, I'll respect your difference of opinion on that matter. And I hope you find the person that you'd rather listen to, who says all the things that you already agree with and who just feeds into your existing beliefs. If you're not willing to be challenged with what you think you know and what you believe, I hope you go find the person that already says all the things you believe and that, you can operate in that bubble if that's what makes you happy. More power to you. But again, those things are a matter for science. And until science makes a conclusive determination, I'm going to remain unconvinced.
Yeah, folks, if you're not happy with what Micah says, then come and listen to my show. It's fine. No, no,
yeah,
and
I endorse this podcast.
I'm going to clip that bit. Thanks. But you're right. I think one of the things that's been thrown at many is the fact that I suppose what I struggled with was they jumped in, like you say, Jaime has a background in things that have turned out not to be true. I'm just trying to be incredibly factual and not opinionated. And there's been a big shout that these are alien beings. And then it was, no, these are non-human beings. These are indigenous to the planet, potentially hybrid, 1,000 years old, but not human. And then thrown all this data, which I don't understand, I'm not a scientist, at us, in poor webcasts or faulty streams, some of it in Spanish, which I don't speak Spanish, I'm sorry, so that doesn't help me either. But then they managed to get 3 outsiders, the Americans involved, which is great because that then looks like, okay, here are some folks who maybe don't have a stake in this being genuine. And the head of those, I can't remember the gentleman's name, yeah, I've lost his name, but the main guy who's the speaker for the 3 said he thinks there may be something to this. However, it's going to take time and they have to follow scientific processes. To which I went, great, that sounds fantastic. However, that seems to have gone amiss from some of the folks who are very keen for this to be out there right now. And I'm quite happy for it to take time. I've also been contacted and heard from folks that have tried to access samples of these and have been declined. It seems very easy for folks to say, well, why doesn't scientist X fly down to Peru and they can, well, time, funding, money. I know folks have been declined that also. Jaime Maussan on a UK, you'll know Howard Hughes here in the UK, Micah. I don't know if you've ever appeared on Howard's own show, but Howard had Jaime Maussan on some months ago when this broke, and Jaime offered to pay for scientists himself to fly out and, from wherever it may be, Oxford, Cambridge in the UK, various scientific institutes. I don't think that ever came to be either. So we're in a state of flux with it. I'm more than happy to entertain it to see if something comes from it, because this is one I would be really happy to be wrong. I'm not in the Stephen Greer camp, but if Stephen Greer can produce bijou for me above the White House in projected form or whatever it might be, wonderful. I will join that camp. It's like you say, it's that you're more than happy to eat your hat on this one, aren't you?
Oh,
Show
yeah, no.
me proof, anyone, and I'm in your camp immediately.
100%. And again, if Mr. Maussan has offered to pay to have scientists come, I mean, that's admirable. I have some issues with past claims he's made, but again, nothing with him as an individual. I've met Jaime before in the past, but again, there are some red flags there, and we have to fairly admit that based on past involvement with situations that ended up being less than credible, and again, were proven predictably to be that. Now, that's part of what informs, I think, my hesitance to get behind this. But again, I have to reiterate to people, there is believing something and wanting to believe it, and then there is its proof as being what you want it to be, or perhaps something else. We need proof. And again, if Jaime's willing to bring people down and there are scientists who are willing to go look, I hope, again, that process unfolds and that there is a beneficial result. Again, I'd be happy to be proven wrong. And this is not unlike my perspective on the whole issue with Grusch needing more information and AARO saying he won't come talk to us. Maybe there's some sort of a miscommunication there. I hope I can see those two parties get together. The same deal applies here. If Jaime will bring them down, and if people are willing to go and conduct analysis, and if real science can be applied, and that is the basis for the determination, I'm happy to be wrong. But again, I just remain unconvinced in the absence of science being applied to this.
A different route that a scientific disclosure might occur again has reared its head in the news, Micah. So Professor Niku Madhusudan is a professor at Cambridge University, and he's been in the news recently. Some sensational headlines, but I think that was just because of the news organizations. This is about to be the most famous man on the planet. Has this man discovered alien life? Essentially, looking through some data from the James Webb, discovered another exoplanet in a different solar system, K2-18b. They have detected, among other gases in the atmosphere, dimethyl sulfide, which on Earth only is produced by life. They believe that not only have they detected this gas, but they believe an abundance of it that, from what I was watching, is produced from the ocean floor. And they're saying it actually produces more than we have here on Earth. So it's very likely there's an ocean on this planet. If we find water, we are very likely to find some form of life, bacterial, microbial, whatever it may be. It's 120 light years away, 2.5 times the size of Earth. But for me, I want to know, do you think we've gone from, AARO as a government organization producing reports on potential UFOs, whistleblowers coming forward who may have seen information, seen proof themselves? We have looked at Nazca Mummies. Have we got alien bodies here on Earth? Is this a more likely scientific way to disclose proof of something else to the public, maybe in preparation for bigger revelations in the near future?
So I've heard others approach this topic in that way. Is this going to be the warm-up act, so to speak, for full-blown disclosure?
Yeah.
We've got to get people kind of ready for the idea that extraterrestrials exist, and it's got to be a gradual process. Now, maybe there's something to that. I heard an excellent lecture at the Soul Foundation conference in Palo Alto last fall by Carl Nell, again, who had been the U.S. Army's liaison to the UAP task force. And I actually got to speak. My colleague Chrissy Newton and I, we spoke for quite a while with Carl Nell. And he's a highly intelligent guy. He's got, I would say, of anyone I have spoken to, as far as former government officials with knowledge of this subject and interest in it, he is one of the most uniquely and well-informed. And the crux of what he had to say at the Soul Foundation event was this idea of how disclosure should happen, and really why sort of a padding to ensure a soft landing has to be essentially constructed from out here on the civilian side of things. And he talked about the terminology, I think, that was used. And again, my friend Matt Phelan had written an article in the Daily Mail that referenced this, but catastrophic disclosure, how this might happen if indeed, rather than a planned, controlled release of information over time, if another nation, for instance, who has similar access to information about UAP, if they were to release this all at once, it could be potentially catastrophic. And that also might be done, even we might say this is simply a hypothetical, but in terms of strategy, that could be done with the intent of destabilizing societies around the world. If a foreign adversary of the United States were to release this information, it might be done to either make the U.S. look bad or to try to cause societal unrest in other ways. Those are all potentials. And again, Colonel Nell had some very interesting perspectives on that. But back to your question about the possible discovery of life as a kind of a prelude to eventual disclosure. I don't know. That could potentially make sense. But what I actually suspect is going on here is that in likelihood it's entirely unrelated. And what we're dealing with is the scientific discovery of, again, we have to distinguish this. It's a biosignature, okay? Yeah. Found in the presence of this biosignature, this chemical component in the in the atmosphere of this distant exoplanet. A technosignature, by contrast, would be evidence of a technological civilization using something probably with the intent of trying to broadcast their presence or to communicate maybe with another civilization. We often think of SETI in terms of they're going to try and communicate with us. SETI might actually end up being more like we pick up on communication between two existing intelligent civilizations and we just intercept their signals, and they don't even know about us, or at very least, if they do, they're not very interested in us. The communication isn't intended for us, but we intercept the signal. I mean, that could be a byproduct of SETI as well. In any case, this is a biosignature. It's not the search for extraterrestrial intelligence so much as it is just the search for extraterrestrial life. But in any case, if we find it, it's going to be huge. It's going to be, again, the answer to the biggest question of all time. And yes, the aforementioned scientist you just referenced would be the most famous person, probably, at least in modern time. And he certainly would be remembered throughout all history for making one of the greatest discoveries of all time, and it not having to do with anything here on this planet. But it has tremendous implications for life on this planet and potentially for life on other planets. Because if we know it could exist elsewhere, then we can proceed logically with the conclusion that it's probable now, not just does it exist? Is it out there? No, that question suddenly becomes, okay, life can exist out there. We know one place where it is. Maybe the James Webb Space Telescope can help us discern other likely locations. Furthermore, the next detection may not be a biosignature. It may be a technosignature. We may actually find evidence of intelligence. And if we do find that, then that leads to the other necessary question. Okay, we've got other intelligences out there, and they are technologically advanced enough that they can communicate with us. Do they have aspirations to be a spacefaring civilization like we do? How much further along might they be than we are? Is it possible that they already have space probes that they're sending to distant galaxies and that they have maybe themselves achieved a form of propulsion that allows for interstellar travel and crewed missions that, again, those individuals could possibly come here? It's going to take several steps to get to the point of recognizing continuity, if any exists, between the discovery of alien life out there and anomalous phenomena we're observing here. Which, bringing us full circle, when we listen to AARO say repeatedly, we have found no evidence of extraterrestrial life, people get angry when they hear them say that. And yet, even though there have been, minor deviations from the primary narrative, initially when Grusch came forward, he wasn't saying, oh yeah, I've got proof that there are alien life forms, extraterrestrials here on planet Earth. He very carefully said non-human intelligence because there was apparently some degree of ambiguity in terms of what these things are and where they're from. So, and granted, again, I have to concede that during the congressional hearings last summer, he did use the E word, extraterrestrial, in response to a few questions from some of the representatives. But I think that the broader point is that that's going to happen. I prefer the word alien as opposed to extraterrestrial myself, because alien leaves open a lot of different possibilities for an exotic intelligence, but from where and of what nature, whereas extraterrestrial seems to be pretty explicitly in reference to a biological entity, from off planet. So in my opinion, there could be some continuity in terms of how Grusch has termed this, what AARO has continued to maintain in terms of what they have not found evidence of, and for us to be able to prove that extraterrestrials are behind anomalous phenomena like UAP, and they very well may be. I think there's some very compelling stories from over the years that do seem to suggest that, but again, they are mostly anecdotal. We don't have that physical sample that we can take into the lab and say, okay, this is the sample that Quezzaga gave abductee A, and now we're going to, analyze this and determine conclusively whether it's from off planet or not. And again, a lot of people get upset when scientists are dismissive of the idea of an ET component with UAP. But that's why, again, a physical scientist wants proof. They want something that they can use that provides unequivocal proof that can be studied and that leaves no ambiguity. That's the problem with dealing in the world of anecdotal data. So again, in conclusion, I would just say that yes, the discovery of alien life out there does present certain inroads toward making further conclusions about what some UAP might represent. But I mean, there are a lot of different stages, I think, milestones along that path that will have to be reached before a scientific determination about that can be made, in the absence, of course, of another alternative, that the operators present themselves and they provide unequivocal information, not only about their presence, but also their origins. If they touch down on the proverbial White House lawn, as, famous narratives in science fiction of, years past have shown, if they touch down and they say, here we are, here's where we're from, you can't deny it any longer, I mean, that'd pretty effectively answer the question, I'd think.
I think to help us get that analytical data that you mentioned, what we would need closer to home are good comprehensive reporting processes. Would you agree? And as luck would have it, this is something that you yourself launched earlier in the year with the UAP sightings reporting system. You can check that at uapsightings.org, link in the description. But Micah, do you want to talk about this? Obviously much closer to home than the James Webb's looking. We're talking about people seeing things here on this planet, but reporting them into a database, yeah?
Absolutely. I'll first acknowledge there are other websites that collect information about UAP sightings. And I mean, some of them, like the National UFO Reporting Center, have been working for many decades. And so some might ask, well, why do we need another one of these websites? There are two simple reasons that were driving my intention for, starting this website. One had been that we had both NASA with their independent study team and all the advice they gave us in their report that they produced, but also AARO. Once AARO's website got up, there were some very interesting PDFs that were included as resources, which described the kind of data that AARO investigators would find helpful in terms of UAP reports, whether they be from military or law enforcement or just civilians out there working in the field, or hanging out on the beach or sitting on the porch at night and looking at the sky. Here's the kind of information that would be useful to us in terms of getting better data and more of it. This is something we kept hearing the panelists with NASA's team saying: we need better data and we need more of it. I remember David Spergel saying that, what might be useful, and this was discussed in the report too, it might be useful to, try to either create or acquire some sort of a website that would allow people to, provide this sort of data, these sorts of criteria. And furthermore, also that they can use smartphones and the multi-different sensory capabilities that each smartphone possesses to obtain this kind of data. And let's be fair, there are websites that are beginning to move in this direction. The National UFO Reporting Center, I already mentioned, has been doing this for a long time. Enigma Labs launched within the last couple of years, I think, and they also are collecting videos and fielding reports. And there are plenty of others, too, that are doing this. I specifically wanted to do this because, I don't think that you can ever have too much data. Well, you could maybe in some circumstances have too much data, but when it comes to the UAP question, if we're saying we need better data and more of it, getting another website that's fielding reports from people, to me, would only be beneficial. But there has to be a right way of going about it. So I intentionally created a reporting form at uapsightings.org, where when people log on to the website, first, of course, there's some criteria. Be careful about what you've seen. It might be this, 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 and this. Here are some known astronomical and other conventional things that you should consider before filing your report. But if what you saw seems genuinely anomalous, then I created a reporting form. I went to several different scientists and experts and got their advice about what kind of criteria might be good to add, in addition to also sourcing information from AARO's website and also from the NASA Independent Study Team's report in terms of the kind of criteria that they would hope to be able to collect information about. And so when you go on the sightings reporting form, you're going to see questions like: did the object appear to exhibit communication with any other objects? Was there a payload that you could observe on this object? Did the object, how did it make you feel? Did you sense any aggression from the object? Do you have any information about the nearest landmarks? Do you have information about latitude and longitude, or could you estimate that? What would you compare the size of the object to if you were looking at the full moon in the night sky? How large would it look in relation to that? This, to me, is the best combination that I feel I was able for now. And there may be, revisions in the future, but for now, this was the best combination of criteria, drawing from AARO's own suggestions, NASA's recent suggestions, and also professionals who have been involved in UAP studies for many decades, who have lots more experience in investigation than I do. And with that combined feedback, the reporting form there, I hope, is going to be something that, in line with what the NASA Independent Study Team and others have said, will be a step toward providing better data and indeed more of it. So again, that's why I launched the UAP sightings reporting system. This is not a for-profit endeavor. There aren't ads or anything on there. I don't profit from this website. In fact, I spend money on it. But it's because I believe in science. Well, that's kind of a funny thing to say, but I believe in the scientific process, and I want to support that. Let's put it that way. And also, I enjoy citizen science. People, I'm not a professional scientist myself, but I enjoy being involved in the collection of data that on down the road scientists may find useful. And we've gotten some really incredible reports recently too. And so some of the things I'm trying to do with the data, first of all, is ensure that people's private information is protected. Even when people say you can use my name and publish that, I don't care. As a general practice, I don't release people's names. I try to ensure privacy for people on all fronts. Summaries of information is provided, except for in some cases where I may actually take direct quotes once I've gone through and ensured that their personal information is removed. And if it's relevant information, I'll sometimes include direct quotes from those witnesses that submit their reports. Otherwise, it's mostly summaries, but with all of the information provided. There are individual reports that for each sighting that is filed, but then there's also a database that's searchable where you can search by criteria that include country, state or province, city name, shape of the object, or date. And then you can search and it will populate the listings of the sightings along with a link, a URL link to the full sighting report that you can go and you can read the entire report that was filed. But the other thing I'm doing also is we're geolocating these on a world map. So each sighting that comes in, once it's processed and it appears in the database, it appears on a map that people can go and look at. So you can go to uapsightings.org, click the sightings map, and you can see if there have been sightings that have occurred historically around you as well. Now, naturally, you might say it's kind of in the beta stage. It was only launched earlier this January. I often get feedback from people, and I'm sure that there will be updates and revisions with time. But right now, again, the primary idea is really to try and get people, if they've seen something, to report their sighting. If it's already been reported to another organization, that's okay. There's a field on the reporting form where I specifically say, if you've reported this to other organizations, mention that here, which would help in terms of data overlap with other organizations in the event that maybe databases are combined at some point. But ultimately, what we hope is that with the collection of more data and better data, and a lot of it over time, when we get, we've got a few hundred reports maybe right now, and there's still a few being processed. But when the sightings reporting system has maybe several thousands of reports, and maybe we can combine that with the best quality reports from other organizations like Newfork or others, maybe then we can employ some statistical analysis. And there are other kinds of analysis that might be done as well with some of the best cases, really good cases that are timely, they've occurred recently. Those might also be able to be investigated, field investigations even, right? So naturally, I'm trying to maintain communication with the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies on this. And in fact, Robert Powell and I have already talked about this a good bit, where when there are really good cases, with the permission, of course, of the witnesses, I'm going to try and loop other researchers in on this and not just keep it exclusive to that organization. Also, keep in mind skeptical groups and other people with other UAP organizations, scientists maybe who don't have a stake in the UAP game, but whose expertise might be useful in some of these investigations. That would be helpful too, I think, in resolving some of these cases. But fundamentally, I just want to ensure that people have a place to report it and that the data is freely available online. And again, that's really the primary thing I think about this project. People can go online, and once they've filed their reports, they can see theirs and they can read about other people's sightings as well. So it's a public resource with sightings information that I hope on down the road, Andy, is going to be in the furtherance of broadening our scientific understanding of these phenomena, whatever different varieties of sources it might have.
Just to mention, Robert Powell's coming on the podcast in the next week or two, so I look forward to that. Had to move that from last week due to illness. And I totally agree, the collaboration in this topic can be fragmented or few and far between. There's a lot of protecting of this is mine and I don't want anyone else to do it, which I don't think helps anyone, does it? And the more of these types of databases that want to collaborate and can share data can only be a good thing. Like you say, if you can cross-examine or whatever the phraseology is to look at the same overlapping data, like you mentioned, this person said this, but this person put this one in, and this app over here. I've got friends who are working on Project Nano, which is an app that's been coming for some time now. Nothing I'm affiliated with myself, but they're doing hard work from what I understand. And when that comes out, again, building some kind of database that they can use an app, locations, people in similar areas, if they're seeing something in real time, can they report it? Multiple sightings, all that kind of stuff. It could alert folks. I don't see that being a bad thing if you've got multiple variations of all this stuff coming out. And I think it's one of those things. I still think people struggle. If you ask 100 folks across the board in UFOs or ufology, how would you report a UFO sighting? There's no one way to do it. There's no standardized way to do it yet. So until that day comes and we have that singularity when it comes to reporting, I think this is very much a necessity. And I would encourage folks to make sure you go and check that out for Micah's site.
Absolutely. Again, anybody who has seen something, they're welcome to submit a report. Now, again, we have to be critical about some of these, and every now and then people will submit a sighting that maybe has a photograph with something in it. And of course, they'll say, we didn't see it at the time the photo was taken, but then this showed up after the fact. Unfortunately, that's kind of a traditional red flag. I know that the National UFO Reporting Center similarly says don't report it if you didn't see it and take the photograph with full knowledge of the object that you were photographing. So again, we have to be discerning, and not every report that's submitted after at least a preliminary analysis, not all of them are going to make their way to the website, but anything that is deemed to be a credible sighting report, and especially if there is some sort of additional documentation, video or photograph entailing what this object might look like and demonstrating its behavior, that's always helpful. We try to get all that information online so that people can, again, benefit from being able to read this. And ultimately, I hope that through additional crowdsourcing, because that's fundamentally how this works, I'm crowdsourcing information from people who have had experiences. I'm hoping we'll additionally be able to crowdsource information from experts. Again, during a recent exchange with Mick West, he had been pointing to an article he wrote several years ago describing what he calls curated crowdsourcing. It's essentially what he does with Metabunk. And I know that a lot of people who are in the pro-UAP camp, they hear Metabunk or Mick West and go, oh gosh, those are the bad guys. I encourage people not to approach it like that, as much as I also encourage skeptics not to think of the UAP proponents like that. I consider myself in the UAP proponent camp. But Mick and I have had some very good dialogue, and I think that his attitude about the idea of curated crowdsourcing, putting the information out there and letting experts find their way to it, and hopefully that information comes back to the director of a sightings reporting website like mine, or again in Mick's case, Metabunk, allowing other people access to that data who have expertise and skill sets beyond our own, so that we can crowdsource an investigation. That's probably going to be the best way going forward. And again, by virtue of the classification problems inherent to AARO, that's one of the limiting factors that prevents them from being able to do that. And that was another reason for launching the UAP sightings reporting system. AARO has a reporting portal on their website right now, a portal through which, if you have knowledge of government programs, you can report to them. But there's nothing for people to report military pilots, or other members of the personnel or the IC community. They can't report UAP sightings through AARO's website yet. And civilians are completely off the table. Supposedly, we're going to have that at some point. But what happens when civilians start making their reports? Are they going to be available on AARO's website? I mean, classification prevents most of that information from being there yet. So, I think it's best to try and keep a lot of that information in the public sector so that we can just get past the whole classification thing, make it freely available to people online, and let scientists and other experts have access to that data so that they can make serious scientific determinations about it.
Well, Micah, I'd love to finish off with some listener questions.
Sure.
The first one, very relevant to what we are literally talking about right now. So William asks, can you give us a readout on any trends or discoveries from your UAP report collection efforts so far?
Yeah, so there are a few. And I think that the two most relevant that I would want to bring up here, well, I'll point out three things. First of all, and I'll also provide the caveat up front that there has not been statistical analysis done yet. So I'm not describing data sets based on trends. I think that we will need more cases reported. And so once people, send those reports in, and it takes time to process them. Right now, this is a one-man show, but eventually I may have to expand the effort and get some volunteers involved. And I've spoken to a few people about that. But again, I hope that statistical analysis over time will be something that can be done here. That all said, a few general trends based on my observations alone. One, there are a lot of people who are coming forward and reporting sightings, sometimes that are decades old. So these are, again, what someone like Mick West might call low information zone sightings or anecdotal sightings. There isn't an image or something and it's decades old, so we can't go out there and see if there's radiation in a field or something. But what is interesting about this is that in terms of the prevalence of the phenomenon, there are a lot of people who have, and also I think the question about stigmas, people are coming forward and saying, I've never talked about this, but I have a family member who listens to your podcast religiously, and they knew this story from the childhood, retellings, and they urged me to come and tell you this. And so if this helps whatever you're trying to do and helps scientists, I'm going to share this story with you. So that's one thing. People, even sometimes decades after the fact, are coming forward for the first time, and maybe because stigmas or other things prevented them from talking about it. Another point, I'm getting a lot of really interesting reports that describe satellite-like phenomena. If you've ever been out on a clear night and you see just a little point of light moving through the sky, like the International Space Station or any number of satellites that are up there, or if you've seen one of the constellations of Starlink where you actually see them moving in a line, it can be very unnerving at first if you don't know what you're looking at, and that's a regular occurrence now with all the Starlink satellites going into orbit. But there are really interesting reports people are logging, some of these also recent as well as decades old, where these points of light will be moving along, and then suddenly the object stops and it'll hover, and then it may begin moving in a different direction, which is very unlike not only satellites, but also very unlike aircraft. I'm actually intrigued by how many people are reporting these things because it may point to one of several potentials. They may be genuine UAP, whatever that is. These might be some kind of orbital technology that's capable of being steered, and they aren't just like, for instance, satellites that are put up into space and then they just remain in an orbit around the planet. Something is capable of stopping, moving, changing direction. So these are, I think, what we would deem to be not extraordinary, but they're nonetheless anomalous characteristics in the context of UAP and the way that witnesses are describing these. And there are a lot of those reports that are coming in. A third trend that I've noticed is, again, the prevalence of triangular UAP. And there are a lot of reports that describe these big, massive black triangles. In fact, I've had at least one of those witnesses on my program, a gentleman whose name I won't release here. He's asked for anonymity, but he and his entire family saw this thing back in the 1980s. There was another gentleman who out in the state of Oregon just a few years ago observed one of these craft for many hours, observed some extremely anomalous characteristics, which included the craft. Again, if this were the leading edge of the triangle, at one point the thing actually approaches near a hilltop where he was, and he hides underneath his Jeep because he's afraid of this object, as you'd think many people would be. It eventually goes away, but then he says he watches it go back down into the valley, and as it begins to hover over a sort of a prominence that he thought might have been like a barn or some sort of a vehicle or some sort of a building down there in the valley, he says it begins to tilt upward, and it's pointing with its leading edge down, and it hovers like this for some time as this little red object comes out of the back of the craft, goes down, and it performs what he said he likens to a grid search. It just goes through the forest and starts moving around in a very defined kind of way. This is a really, really strange report, but it's consistent with other reports of these large black triangular aircraft that really have been collected since the 1980s. And in fact, the Federation of American Scientists even talked about some of these things seemingly orienting themselves vertically like that as opposed to horizontally. So that's the third trend. There are a lot of those triangular reports, and there's a remarkable degree of consistency between these that either to me is suggestive of one of two things. Either we do have some sort of a very large stealth blimp or other kind of advanced aerospace vehicle that's been in use for many decades, and this has somehow remained in the black projects world, or somebody else has something out there that is very large, capable of a degree of stealth. They are seen frequently enough that people report these things. I've gotten a lot of these reports at the UAP sightings reporting system, and again, it's consistent with existing traditional reports of observations of these craft. And again, I'll just refer the listener to the excellent book by my colleague David Marler, who now heads up the National UFO Historical Records Center out near Albuquerque, New Mexico. But his book, Triangular UFOs, An Estimate of the Situation, will tell you all about these large craft, or at least everything that's known.
just pointing to the very book just there.
Yeah,
That's the one. Excellent.
I've got my copy right over here.
And do you know what? It's interesting, the Starlink thing, and I'd like to think I'm not easily fooled by any kind of sighting. I live in an area with pretty clear skies. I see a lot of satellites. I see the ISS quite often. I see lots of little lights just dashing across the sky. And do you know what? It could be some ET vehicle, but if it doesn't make a sharp turn or an abrupt stop, I'll treat it as it's a satellite going overhead, and that's it. I see quite a lot of that, though, where I live. However, a few months ago, genuinely spooked myself driving along a pretty busy road, motorway we've got here, or dual carriageway, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
I've seen Starlink before, and I remember the first time I saw it, there was 26 of them, I think it was. The
Uh-huh.
first one came overhead, the second, the third, and it's pretty incredible when you first see it, especially this train of satellites going over. I saw 5 Starlinks at such a strange angle. At first, I thought someone had a massive crane, like construction crane, and had
Yep.
tilted it almost over the motorway. And it was the way I would liken it is imagine, the Star Wars writing when it scrolls at the beginning of Star Wars A New Hope and it goes up across the screen. Imagine that, but inverted, as if that was up over the sky. And
Yeah.
it was the oddest sight to see. And it didn't even look like they were moving because of the angle they were at. It looked like someone had suspended 5 stars really close down, not where stars normally are. And I drove along the motorway and I tried to film it and I couldn't get it because I was driving, fast and it's out the window. And when I got home that night, I remember saying to my wife, like, I saw this really amazing thing earlier. And I want to say it was the Starlink satellites, but they weren't moving and the angle, it looked so strange. Straight away on Facebook, a few people had mentioned similar things and roughly the same location I'm at. And then someone posted a video from where they are, and it was like, saw Starlink earlier, and from their angle, you saw the movement, you saw the stars, but I've never seen them at that angle before. I'm used to seeing them up high, going way over, traveling at a distance. It was so strange, but I could see why anyone going past that would say that's some kind of massive craft
I'm
lighting up the
laughing.
sky.
I'm laughing as you're saying this because I mean that's exactly the same thought process. When I first saw one of the satellite trains like that, I thought, man, somebody's doing construction and that crane is way up there. I thought the exact same thing. What that seems to say to me, by the way, Andy, is that the human mind, we naturally go through this process of when you see something you don't understand, you start going, maybe it's this, maybe it's that, maybe it's this, and you start going through this kind of checkbox, list in your mind of what could that be. I did the exact same thing, literally thought crane, and then noticed that they were moving up through the sky. It reminded me of Star Wars and the opening, sequence and everything with the lettering, and literally thought the same thing. And I'll further add, I knew exactly what it was after a couple of seconds. And I was up in a mountain town coming back from a show with my band and everything. And I swerve into this parking lot and literally I jump out of the car like Batman, and everybody in this parking lot's looking up at the thing going, what in the world? And somebody literally says, this guy looks like he knows what that is. And I literally tell everybody in the parking lot, I said, don't worry, folks, you're looking at Starlink. But I mean, they were really genuinely freaked out. And so I thought it was so funny when they see my car swerve into the parking lot. They're like, yeah, this guy knows what that is. So my friend Brett Tingley, too, formerly a writer for the War Zone, and now he is an editor at space.com. But Brett also, I remember one night he came in from a gig. He also is a musician right here in my region, and we keep in touch, even play together sometimes. But Brett had been coming home one night, and he said, I think I saw something I can't explain tonight. He said it looked like a white line moving through the sky. And initially he was kind of baffled too. And then we found videos like you're describing of it when seen at the right angle.
Yeah.
And from the right distance, the different separate Starlink satellites can have the appearance of being a single straight white line moving through the night sky.
I could see that, yeah.
Which can look extremely anomalous. So yeah, but Brett was clearly looking at Starlink too. And I mean, within a few minutes, he figured that out too, like you did. He found videos online. But I mean, I have to say, a lot of people are seeing Starlink, and you see every now and then UAP reports come in. They're saying it had to have been a mothership. It was just like a big flat white line moving through the sky. And I'm like, yeah, I think I do know what that was. It wasn't a mothership.
Do you know, as frustrating as it is for folks who are UFO enthusiasts like ourselves, maybe it will get more of the general public just looking up at the sky anyway and maybe seeing, taking their heads out their phones for a minute when they're walking.
Well, you can track satellites and you can track Starlink too using various apps. And so I actually encourage people to get out there, not only to familiarize yourself with what Starlink looks like, because with respect to pilots, I mean, occasionally I do get videos that pilots will send along that are rocket launches. Sometimes it's satellites, sometimes it's Starlink. And it's natural that people see things, and sometimes in circumstances where they don't get a good look at it or there's other limited information, mistakes do happen. It's easy to mistake Starlink for UFOs, and that happens a lot. So I'm just saying, maybe get out there, spend some time, with an app. They're worth watching, and you may also help to familiarize yourself and others with what Starlink looks like. But apart from all that, they're actually really cool to see when you can spot them.
Absolutely. A follow-up question from William. He asks, it's quite a short question, but I'll provide some context to what I
Sure.
think it is. He asks, what is Chris Mellon's plan? Now, for me, I had heard last year Chris Mellon is pulling back from the UFO UAP topic somewhat, from a pretty direct source. I'll just say that much. You're someone who's a contact with Chris Mellon. He's written for the debrief on numerous occasions, which is always good to see. What do you see as Chris Mellon's current and ongoing role in UFO UAP disclosure?
First of all, Chris is an intellectual, and Chris is somebody who, like me, is really, really well versed in the history of this topic. At times, Chris actually points out things that I didn't know. I mean, he's really, really astonishing in terms of the knowledge that he has about this subject. I would say that I think some of his critics, and generally the critics of the modern UAP dialogue and government insiders coming out and talking about this, those people kind of see no distinction between Chris and, for instance, Lou Elizondo and all the other people who worked with the OSAP and ATIP and whatever. To me, I don't apply batch thinking to it. Well, if Chris Mellon says something, that's reflective of the entire belief system of Lou Elizondo and Jay Stratton and Travis Taylor and David Grusch. People tend to kind of think about that in kind of broad swaths.
Yeah,
I don't. Chris, I see as somebody who, entirely independent of anybody else, is just very devoted to trying to get to the bottom of what the UFO issue is, or UAP as we now say. He tries to be a person who educates the public. He tries to be a person who provides assistance to government. I mean, Chris was extremely instrumental in trying to help get those whistleblowers to AARO, including David Grusch. Chris, of course, we now know, it came out a few years back that he had been essentially responsible for a lot of the information that was provided to the Washington Post and namely the New York Times. Chris has been I could argue, I think, that Chris has really been the driving force behind all of the real revelations we've seen since 2017. And the outcome of all that evidently has been, no matter what you think of AARO, and its past leadership or current leadership and the reports and things that it produces, we have an office within the DoD that is officially tasked with attempting to study these phenomena and resolve cases where they can. That has been a pretty tremendous outgrowth, I should say, of all the efforts that began in 2017. And Chris Mellon has been a part of that all along. To say that he's been trying to step away from or get out of UFO investigation, I think no more than anybody else, but I think that we all at times start seeing this topic and all the debate and all the fighting and all the stuff, the dangling carrot phenomenon, which is something that I think frustrates a lot of people, myself included. Wait, there's something really big coming, folks. We got big developments on the way.
soon.
And everybody's always kind of
Soon.
waiting,
Yeah.
soon. It's coming any day now, well, again, I get frustrated with all that too. From what I can tell, and I do keep in touch with Chris, he is someone who's just as devoted to this as any of us, and he's just as interested. And I think that more than anything, his personal interest in this phenomena, but also his devotion to government transparency, those are things that drive his interest. And I see no indication that Chris intends to get out of this. I think that he's probably, for the remainder of his days, he will be devoted until there is some sort of resolution. He's going to continue to follow this topic, and he remains very interested. And I appreciate that about him.
Well, next question is from Chris Mellon. No, it's not. I wish. Next question is from Jeff. Just as good as Chris Mellon. Jeff asks, Micah goes to great lengths and seems very practiced and disciplined at maintaining an air of heavy skepticism regarding the non-human intelligence hypothesis on his show. So, all cards on the table, once and for all. Does Micah personally believe there is enough physical evidence and credible witness testimony to conclude with a reasonable amount of scientific certainty that our planet is being engaged and or observed by an advanced non-human intelligence civilization not born on this earth?
Excellent question, Jeff. I don't think that there is publicly accessible data that yet provides a clear case for that. And I know that a lot of people, yet again, they're going to get angry, and I'm losing all the people out there who are the diehard proponents. But I'm not saying that it's not a possibility. I'm simply saying that there's not enough data that would satisfy a scientist, and that a group of scientists, if they were to analyze that write a paper. The paper undergoes peer review. It's presented at a scientific symposium, and then it's released to the press. And there are articles written about it in television interviews, and then films and documentaries on Netflix. And everybody accepts the conclusions, which are unequivocally extraterrestrial intelligence is here on Earth. They've been visiting, and it's a reality. I don't think we have enough data to get us to that point yet. Otherwise, it would be happening, or it would have already happened. But it's not impossible that we will get there in the next few years. Again, coming back to the discussion about the James Webb Space Telescope, and it's potentially within the next few months, if not the few years, next few years, potentially breaking open this whole question about whether we're alone in the universe. I mean, if there are microbes that we can confirm the existence of in the atmosphere of an exoplanet, that still answers the question about whether alien life exists. The question then will be, does there seem to be any intelligent life out there? And then a next natural progression, as I kind of outlined earlier, would be, how do we understand, or what do we understand about this intelligence and what its capabilities are? And is it possible that they have either explored the cosmos or may actually be, continually exploring Earth and surveying us, perhaps? I mean, what are they doing here? Are they collecting resources? Are they studying us? Are they doing abductions and things? Who knows? They're doing, if they are, that sounds like a lot of scientific work. Things very similar to what wildlife biologists, when they go out into nature, would do. They might put an animal down in a very humane way. I'm talking about tranquilization, not killing them, but they'd tranquilize a bear and study it, maybe put a tracker on it, right? It's not impossible that kind of thing could happen, but I don't think that we have enough data to reach a scientific consensus. So again, I am very interested in the reports of landings of UAP, reports that describe humanoid occupants especially, reports that describe potential communication, sometimes verbally, sometimes what seems to be telepathically. None of these things are enough to satisfy scientists, but it's a lot of data that is very interesting. And if we were to take that data as being indicative of a reality, it seems to strongly point to there being some kind of intelligence of unknown origin behind some of these UAP. My job is, as both a researcher but also as a citizen scientist, to try and collect as many facts, details, and as much eyewitness testimony as possible in building that case so that scientists can evaluate that information and eventually maybe move us toward that reality. I just don't think we're there yet.
Here's a good question from Christian, and I'm going to read it as he's written it, and he maybe asks it, gives some context, and asks it again. But I'm going to keep it the way it is, Christian. Why do insiders, Mellon in particularly, in the article in the debrief, say a secret of this magnitude that affects every human being on the planet won't come from AARO? Again, why does he think people like Chris Mellon are saying it will affect all 8 billion of us? My family, this is Christian, knows aliens are real and they don't care. I can tell my neighbour across the street and they'll go back to watching football. In Micah's previous episode, he said one of the reasons they don't want to talk about it is because they don't know much about it. I think most people in government don't, but those in the programme know a lot more. Do you think Chris Mellon and people like David Grusch know something deeper that would actually affect all 8 billion of us besides UFOs are real and they are here?
So that's a really good question, Christian. And I would point back to the classification problem that I was discussing earlier. My view on that, and then I'll talk about what people do and don't know and why Mellon has said some of the things he was talking about. But my view on that is essentially this. If it comes to a scientific revelation that really is going to affect everybody on planet Earth, that to me, in principle, should not be classified. Most of the information about UFOs, supposedly, because there is some that has been retained by agencies like the National Security Agency and others, most of that information, we are told, has to do with ways and means, sources and methods, signals intelligence, whatever, protecting the ways that we collect information and protecting things that are of a sensitive nature, mostly about the systems and capabilities that we have so that our enemies don't know that we have those or how those systems and capabilities work. Now, there's always the possibility that there are deeper realities about UAP that the government is withholding. As far as the question of whether Grusch or Chris Mellon knows those things, I don't know. What I do know is that following the FOIA release the other day, where Mr. Mellon was, of course, one of the individuals in an exchange, and these were screenshots of signal conversations that he and Sean Kirkpatrick had had. I was initially kind of confused about that because, and I think actually Chris Mellon was too, in theory, a person's name would be probably redacted if private communications on a person's smartphone were deemed to be releasable as part of a FOIA request like that. Now, I think that the reason why those copies of that conversation, portions of it, were included is because there were screenshots taken of the signal communications, presumably by Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, because it was on his government phone, and he included those screenshots as attachments to the memorandum for record, and all of that information being responsive to the FOIA request ended up being released. And John Greenwald helped to clarify some of that. That, I think, is why those were included in that FOIA release. But really, essentially, after that came out, Chris Mellon on his personal, I think it was his Substack site.
Yep.
He actually, first of all, this is fascinating. Not only did he provide screenshots of a communication he had with another government official who he says is far more well-read and knowledgeable of what's going on in government even than David Grusch, but he says, I cleared this for release through DOPSR, okay? And this individual, their name is redacted, but I mean, I'm showing you what this person conveyed to me as an indication of the kind of statements that caused us to think that there's a program in the first place. So that was officially cleared for release. That person's name is redacted, but Mellon posted that on his own Substack as an indication, he says, of the kinds of things that others in government have told him. I would take that statement, and also the fact that he says this guy's more well-read and deeply involved in all this than Grusch, to mean that this individual knows more than both Mellon and Grusch, and therefore it expresses or helps us to quantify the limitations on what Grusch and Mellon might know, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
So I think that as far as what they know, a lot of it's classified, especially in Grusch's case. He famously does not talk about those specifics. He says that information, as was conveyed to him by people with knowledge of the program, he said was provided to the relevant authorities, or those individuals were directed to the appropriate authorities, and those disclosures were made. And he further reiterates that, again, he has faith in the ICIG and the process of the Inspector General, apart from the processes currently within the DoD, i.e. AARO and its investigations. So all of that said, my read on this is that these people obviously seem to have knowledge of the claims of others involving a program, but there are limitations to what they themselves know. Nonetheless, Mellon, and presumably Grusch also, but especially in that exchange the other day released by Mellon, that pretty clearly shows to me that they believe that some of these people who are conveying this information to them is credible. And it seems to point to the idea that there is indeed a program, and that program has some sort of relevance to UAP crash wreckage retrievals and the acquisition of non-human intelligence. Now, the final point I think that Christian that was addressing there was, for people who already believe that this is happening, or who have had personal experiences that confirm this sort of thing to them, maybe these revelations aren't going to change their minds very much. But again, if it is indeed conclusively determined that Grusch's claims and the information he provided, for instance, to the ICIG last year, if that can be validated in any way, and that information eventually comes out, yet again, it will be one path toward, making the great discovery about we aren't alone. What are these things? Where are they from? Are they extraterrestrial? Something else? Who knows? But that's a path toward kind of the same effort, I think, that's currently occurring in the SETI and just more generally the alien biology searches that are ongoing. We just want to know if we're alone in the universe. A lot of people want to know if we're being visited right here on this planet. Wouldn't it be a tragic irony if we didn't look in our own backyard at the things that are flying around in our own skies, if they did indeed turn out to be extraterrestrials? We could answer the question potentially by looking right here on Earth. So I think we should.
I'll say thank you to Pedro, Pete, and Cams. You asked questions that have been answered within the interview, so thank you very much to everyone else. Micah, you've been incredibly generous with your time. If you were charging by the hour, I would be poor at this rate, so thank you so much for joining us. If you want to just wrap up, letting the listeners know what you're up to, how they can listen to your content, how they can find you on socials.
Certainly. I mean, you can find me online at my website, micahhanks.com. And usually if you just search for my name, Micah Hanks, that's me on most of the social media, but they're on my website. I've got my Twitter page, or X as they now call it, Instagram, everything else. And of course, I am working over there daily at the DeBrief.org, overseeing the editorial and also producing content. Some of it's related to UAP, some of it's related to other areas of science, technology, and defense, but a lot of it also sort of tangentially related. As far as the podcast, again, the Micah Hanks program in various iterations has been running now weekly for more than a decade. The name changed, but again, the program remains the same. And so you can find the Micah Hanks program there at my website as well, or anywhere podcasts are found, Apple Podcast or what have you. And then as far as things yet to come, again, I've got the UAP sightings reporting system that's, again, working to try and collect more data. And I've got, believe it or not, some other projects that are UAP related, because apart from my work as an aerospace and defense and science reporter with the DeBrief and what have you, I mean, at the end of the day, I am fascinated with this subject, and I want to contribute as much knowledge as I can to it. And so that's why I'm assisting groups like National UFO Historical Records Center, Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies, and others. And folks can definitely expect some new projects, I hope, by the end of the year, in the furtherance of our great mystery of UAP and what it all means.
Well, I'll be very honest, folks. I don't have a lot of notifications set up on my phone, and this isn't bullshit. This is true. There are two news organizations that I get Twitter alerts from, or X, and one is the DeBrief. So that's not just the UAP stuff. That's just any Twitter notification. So that's how much provenance I put in the DeBrief, the reporting. Obviously, I've got the UAP side of things, but I do enjoy the science news that comes from it as well. So big thank you to Micah and the rest of the gang over there. Keep up the good work. Big thank you from me, and look forward to speaking to you again very soon.
Thank you as always, Andy. A pleasure to be here with you.